Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of Europe's most glittering ballrooms, where beneath the silk gowns and diamond tiaras, women were living double lives that would make modern scandals look tame. Imagine being told exactly who to marry, when to speak, how to sit, and that your only purpose in life was to produce a male heir and then disappear into the background. Now imagine saying no to all of that, knowing it could cost you everything, your children, your freedom, even your life. What would you risk for love, for power, for the simple right to be yourself? So before we dive into these incredible true stories together, I would absolutely love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we are exploring tonight. And I am curious, where are you watching from right now? Are you tucked in bed in New York, listening from London? Maybe you are somewhere I have never even heard of. Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and honestly, your messages make my day. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let us step back in time together. Picture this. It is 1774. And you are a 17-year-old girl waking up in one of England's grandest estates. Servants bring you breakfast on silver trays. Your closet is filled with gowns that cost more than most people earn in a lifetime. You are about to marry the richest, most eligible bachelor in the entire country. Sounds like a fairy tale, right? Wrong. Because here is what they do not tell you in the fairy tales. That man you are marrying, you barely know him. You met him maybe twice before the wedding was arranged, and after you say "I do," you will quickly discover he is cold, distant, and already has a mistress. But you cannot complain, you cannot leave, you cannot even cry too loudly because someone might hear, and then people will talk. Welcome to the reality of noble life for women in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Come on, they were rich. They lived in palaces. How bad could it really be? And yes, they had wealth beyond imagination. But let me paint you the full picture, because the truth is so much more complicated and honestly, so much sadder than you might expect. From the moment a girl was born into a noble family, her entire life was mapped out like a chess game. And she was not the player, she was the piece. Her parents would decide who she married, and that decision had nothing to do with love, nothing to do with compatibility. It was about alliances, about merging estates, about political power. Think of it as a business merger, except instead of companies, it was human beings. The wedding would happen when she was anywhere from 14 to 18 years old. Just think about that for a second. 14. An age when most of us today are worried about high school exams or what to wear to prom. These girls were being handed over to men they did not know, often men twice their age or older, and told, "This is your husband now. Obey him, make him happy, give him sons." And that last part, that was not just important, it was everything. A noble wife had exactly one job that truly mattered: produce a male heir. If you had daughters, people would offer polite congratulations, but behind your back they would whisper, "Poor thing, she cannot seem to have a boy." If you had miscarriages, the blame fell entirely on you. If years went by without children, people would say you were cursed, or worse, that you were failing at the one thing women were supposedly made to do. The pressure was absolutely crushing, but it gets worse. Even if you did have that precious son, even if you fulfilled your duty perfectly, you still were not free, because there were rules. Oh, so many rules. A noble woman could not be too educated. That was seen as unfeminine and threatening. She could not express political opinions in public. That was a man's domain. She could not choose her own friends without approval. She definitely could not take a lover, even if her husband had 3 mistresses paraded around openly. The double standard was not just accepted, it was built into the very fabric of society. If she gambled and lost money, she was called reckless and irresponsible. If her husband gambled away fortunes, people shrugged and said, "Boys will be boys." If she showed too much interest in politics, she was meddling and unnatural. If her husband made terrible political decisions, he was just learning or misguided. And here is the truly terrifying part. If a noble woman broke these rules, the consequences were not just social embarrassment. We are talking about real devastating punishments. Let me give you some examples because I want you to understand just how high the stakes were. If a woman was caught in an affair, she could be divorced, which in those days meant complete social death. She would lose her children always. The law gave fathers absolute custody. She would lose her home, her money, her position in society. Overnight, she would go from being a duchess or countess to being essentially a ghost. Respectable people would not invite her to their homes. Her own family might disown her out of shame. She would spend the rest of her life in some remote estate, hidden away like a shameful secret. But that was if she was lucky. If she was not lucky, if the scandal was big enough, or if powerful people wanted to make an example of her, the punishment could be far worse. Exile to a foreign country where she knew no one, imprisonment in a cold castle with no visitors, and in extreme cases, especially in earlier centuries, even execution. Yes, you heard that right. Women were killed for the crime of loving the wrong person or speaking out against the wrong king. So when you hear the stories we're going to explore in this series, when you hear about women who gambled enormous fortunes, who took lovers, who threw themselves into politics, who dressed as men and rode horses astride instead of side saddle, who openly defied their husbands and society itself, I want you to remember what they were risking. They were not just risking their reputations, they were risking everything. Now you might be wondering, why would anyone take such insane risks? Why not just play it safe, follow the rules, live a quiet if unhappy life? And that is such a good question, because the answer tells us something profound about human nature. Some of these women broke the rules because they fell desperately, madly into love with someone they were not supposed to love. And when you are truly in love, when your heart is completely consumed by another person, sometimes the idea of living without them feels worse than any punishment society could inflict. Love made them brave, or maybe love made them reckless, probably both. Other women broke the rules because they were ambitious. They looked around at the men making all the decisions, running countries into the ground with their incompetence, and thought, I could do better than that. They saw opportunities for power and influence, and I grabbed them with both hands, even knowing society would punish them for it. They were willing to trade safety for significance. And then there were the women who broke the rules simply because they could not stand the cage anymore. Imagine being intelligent, creative, passionate, full of ideas and energy, and being told every single day that your only value is your ability to look pretty and produce children. Some women could accept that. They made peace with it. But others felt like they were suffocating. And eventually something inside them would snap and they would think, I would rather live 1 year as myself than 50 years as the person they want me to be. That is courage. Terrifying, possibly foolish, but absolutely real courage. Now, over the next several hours, we are going to meet some of these extraordinary women, and I am not going to lie to you and say they were all heroes. Some of them made terrible choices, some of them hurt people, lied to people, used people. They were flawed and complicated and sometimes selfish, just like all of us. But they were also brave in ways we can barely imagine today. We are going to meet a duchess who became the most famous woman in England, who changed politics forever, but who gambled away millions and lived in a scandalous love triangle for 24 years. We are going to meet a teenage queen who was married to a madman, who fell in love with her husband's doctor, and whose affair literally changed the course of a country's history before ending in one of the most brutal executions you have ever heard of. We are going to meet the most hated queen in French history, whose rumoured love affair with a handsome Swedish count has been debated for over 2 centuries, and whose story ended under the blade of a guillotine while thousands cheered. And we are going to meet women who fought duels, who became pirates, who were crowned after death, who defied every single expectation and lived life entirely on their own terms. Their stories are shocking, they are romantic, they are heartbreaking, and they are all completely true. Before we dive into individual stories, I want to leave you with one more thought. When we judge these women, and trust me, people have been judging them for centuries, we have to remember the world they lived in. It is so easy to look back from our comfortable modern perspective and say, well, she should not have done that, or that was so reckless. But we are not living in a society where our entire identity and survival depends on following rules designed to control us. These women were trapped in a system that saw them as property, as political pawns, as baby-making machines. And some of them decided they would rather burn that system down, even if they burned themselves in the process, than live one more day inside the cage. Were they right to do what they did? Were they selfish or brave? Victims or villains? Honestly, I think the answer is different for each woman and each situation. And that is what makes these stories so endlessly fascinating. There are no simple answers. There are just complicated human beings making impossible choices in circumstances we can barely comprehend. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Try to put yourself in their shoes, or rather, their silk slippers. Ask yourself, what would I have done? How much would I have been willing to risk for love, for freedom, for the chance to be myself? And get ready, because starting in the next part, we are diving deep into one of the most scandalous lives in all of British history. We are talking about a woman who had it all: beauty, wealth, fame, influence, and who risked absolutely everything for the things that mattered to her. A woman whose gambling debts would make your jaw drop, whose love life was so complicated it would put any reality TV show to shame, and whose impact on politics was so significant that people are still writing books about her over 200 years later. Her name was Georgiana, Duchess of Devonshire, and trust me, you are not going to believe what this woman got up to. The gambling alone is absolutely wild. But when you hear about the love triangle she lived in for over 2 decades, and the impossible choice she was forced to make between the man she loved and her own children, well, let us just say you will understand why her story has fascinated people for centuries. So take a deep breath, settle in, and get ready for a story that has everything: glamour, heartbreak, scandal, and one woman's desperate attempt to find happiness in a world determined to deny it to her. Coming up next, the incredible, tragic, absolutely unbelievable true story of Georgiana. Alright, let me tell you about a woman who was basically the Princess Diana of the 1700s, and I am not exaggerating. The comparisons are so striking that historians have been drawing parallels between these two women for decades. Both were young girls thrust into marriages with men who did not love them. Both became fashion icons whose every outfit was copied across the nation. Both struggled with eating disorders and depression. Both were beloved by the public but miserable in private. And both were, in a very real sense, trapped. But here is where Georgiana's story gets really interesting. Because unlike Diana, who came centuries later, Georgiana had absolutely no guidebook for navigating fame, no therapist to talk to, no real support system at all. What she did have was an addictive personality, access to unlimited money, well, sort of, and a desperate need to feel something, anything other than the emptiness of her marriage. So let me take you back to June 7th, 1774. Georgiana Spencer is 17 years old and it is her birthday, but instead of cake and presents, she is getting married. Now her full name is Lady Georgiana Spencer, and if that last name sounds familiar, it should. She comes from one of the wealthiest, most powerful families in England. Her family owns Althorpe Estate, which, yes, is the same estate where Princess Diana grew up and is now buried. The Spencers were nobility royalty, if that makes sense. They had land, money, political influence, everything. But here is the thing about being a Spencer daughter in 1774. You are basically a very expensive bargaining chip. Georgiana's parents have been grooming her for this moment her entire life. They have taught her to dance, to speak French, to play the harp, to do needlework, all the things a proper duchess needs to know. But they have not prepared her for the reality of who she is about to marry. William Cavendish, the 5th Duke of Devonshire, is 26 years old. He is, and I am not making this up, the most eligible bachelor in all of England. Not just rich, we are talking about one of the wealthiest men in the entire country. His family owns Chatsworth House, which is essentially a palace. They own thousands of acres of land. They have political power that would make modern billionaires jealous. On paper, Georgiana is about to have a fairy tale wedding. But let me tell you what nobody tells 17-year-old Georgiana on her wedding day. Her new husband is cold. And I do not mean he's a little reserved or shy. I mean he's emotionally frozen solid. William Cavendish has the personality of a brick wall. He barely speaks to her. When he does speak, it is usually to criticize something. He shows more affection to his hunting dogs than he does to his teenage bride. And here is the kicker. He already has a mistress when they get married. A woman named Charlotte Spencer, who, in a twist that would make a soap opera writer blush, is actually a distant relative of Georgiana's. William does not even try to hide this relationship. He just expects Georgiana to accept it because that is how noble marriages work. Can you even imagine? You are 17 years old, you just married this man in front of hundreds of people. You are now the Duchess of Devonshire, one of the highest-ranking women in England. And on your wedding night, your husband is thinking about someone else. Georgiana tries so hard to make it work, she really does. She studies everything she thinks will make him happy. She learns about his political interests. She tries to be the perfect wife, but William remains distant, uninterested, almost annoyed by her efforts to connect with him. And then comes the pressure that nearly breaks her. Georgiana needs to produce a son. That is her job. That is literally the entire reason William married her. His family needs a male heir to inherit the title and the fortune. So there is this constant suffocating pressure to get pregnant and have a boy. But month after month goes by and nothing happens. Then she does get pregnant, and she is so relieved, so hopeful, but she has a miscarriage, then another, then another. Over and over again, her body fails her, or at least that is how everyone makes her feel about it. The whispers start. People at court begin saying maybe she is barren. Maybe God is punishing her for something. Maybe William should set her aside and find a new wife who can actually do the one thing duchesses are supposed to do. Can you feel the pressure? Can you imagine what that does to a young woman's mental health? So Georgiana does what a lot of people do when their home life is unbearable. She throws herself into social life. And this is where her story starts to get really interesting, because it turns out Georgiana has a natural gift for being the centre of attention. Almost overnight, she becomes the most famous woman in England. Everything she wears becomes a trend. She shows up to a party with a 3-foot-tall hairstyle decorated with ostrich feathers, and suddenly every woman in London wants the same look. She wears a certain shade of brown and it gets named Devonshire brown. She invents a new kind of dance called the Devonshire Minuet, and it sweeps the nation. The press cannot get enough of her. This is before paparazzi and Instagram, obviously, but there are these satirical prints and newspapers that follow her every move. They write about what she wore, who she talked to, where she went. She is the original influencer, except she is influencing an entire country. But here is what the public does not see. Behind all the glamour and the parties and the fame, Georgiana is desperately unhappy, and that unhappiness leads her down a path that will eventually destroy her financially and nearly ruin her life. She discovers gambling. Now I need you to understand that gambling in 18th century England was not like going to Vegas for the weekend. This was a full-blown obsession for the upper classes. Nobles would gather at houses like Devonshire House and play cards from dinner time until dawn. We are talking about 12, 14, 16-hour gambling sessions. The games they played had names like Pharaoh, Whist, and Loo, and the stakes were absolutely insane. Georgiana starts out small like most addicts do. A few pounds here and there. It is exciting. It makes her feel alive. When she is at the gambling table, she is not thinking about William's coldness or her failed pregnancies or the constant pressure to be perfect. She is just feeling the rush of the game, but then the losses start to pile up. And this is where Georgiana's story becomes a cautionary tale about addiction that feels painfully modern. Because she starts doing all the things addicts do. She lies about how much she has lost. She borrows money from friends, promising she will pay them back next week. She takes out loans from banks, using her jewellery as collateral. She begs her mother for help, swearing this is the last time. But it is never the last time. By 1789, and I want you to really hear this number, Georgiana owes £60,000. In today's money, that is approximately $8 million US. 8 million. Gone. Lost at the gambling tables. Her creditors start showing up at Devonshire House demanding payment. Some of them literally chase her down the street shouting about the money she owes them. She starts having panic attacks. She cannot sleep. She is drinking heavily. She is taking laudanum, which is basically liquid opium that people used as medicine back then. And William? William uses her debt as leverage over her. He will pay off some of it, but only if she agrees to his conditions, only if she lets him do whatever he wants, only if she stays quiet about his affairs. Is financial abuse wrapped up in a noble marriage? But here is what makes Georgiana's story so much more than just a cautionary tale about gambling. Because while she is struggling with addiction and debt and a miserable marriage, she is also doing something absolutely revolutionary. She is becoming a political powerhouse. Remember, this is the late 1700s. Women are not supposed to be involved in politics at all. They're supposed to sit quietly and look pretty while men make all the important decisions. But Georgiana looks at that rule and basically says, "Yeah, I am going to break that one." She becomes deeply involved with the Whig Party, which is one of the two major political factions in England at the time, and she does not just attend their meetings or host their dinners. She becomes a political operative. She is strategizing, fundraising, organizing, campaigning. In 1780, she does something that shocks the entire country. She climbs up onto the hustings, that is, the platform where political speeches are given, at Westminster and publicly supports a candidate named Charles James Fox. Now you have to understand, women do not do this. Ever. The idea of a duchess, a woman of the highest social rank, getting up in public and engaging in politics is scandalous. It is like if a modern-day celebrity suddenly announced they were running for office, except way more shocking because society had even stricter gender roles back then. But Georgiana does not care, or rather she cares so much about the political causes she believes in that she is willing to endure the scandal. And then comes 1784, and Georgiana does something that people are still talking about 240 years later. There is a major election happening in Westminster. Charles James Fox, the leader of the Whigs and Georgiana's close friend, is running to keep his seat in Parliament. The stakes are enormous. If Fox loses, the Whigs lose power. If the Whigs lose power, all the political reforms Georgiana believes in will die. So what does she do? She hits the streets. The Duchess of Devonshire, one of the most famous and highest-ranking women in England, starts going door to door in the roughest neighbourhoods of Westminster, asking butchers and cobblers and tavern keepers to vote for Fox. Can you picture this? A woman who normally would not be caught dead in these neighbourhoods, wearing gowns that cost more than these men earn in a year, walking up to them and asking for their political support. The campaign works. Fox wins, but the scandal is enormous, because people start spreading rumours about how Georgiana is getting these votes. Political cartoons show her kissing butchers and tradesmen in exchange for their support. The accusations are brutal and almost certainly exaggerated or completely made up. But this is how society punishes women who step outside their prescribed roles. They sexualize their political work. They turn legitimate political organizing into something dirty and shameful. One famous cartoon from that time, which you can still find in museums today, is titled The Devonshire, or Most Approved Method of Securing Votes. It shows Georgiana kissing a butcher who has a huge grin on his face. The implication is clear: women cannot possibly gain political influence through intelligence or hard work. They must be using their sexuality. It is character assassination disguised as political commentary, and it is devastatingly effective. After this election, Georgiana mostly withdraws from public political life. The criticism is too intense. The rumours are too damaging. She continues to influence politics behind the scenes, but she never again campaigned so publicly. And here is the sad truth. If Georgiana had been a man doing exactly the same things, campaigning, strategizing, organizing voters, she would have been celebrated as a brilliant political mind. But because she is a woman, she is treated as a scandal. The double standard is so obvious it hurts. Now, I want to pause here and acknowledge something important. Georgiana was not a perfect person. She was privileged beyond belief. She made terrible financial decisions that hurt people who trusted her. She borrowed money from friends and never paid them back. She could be manipulative when it served her interests. But she was also genuinely trying to make a difference in the world she lived in. She believed in political reform, she believed in helping the poor, and she actually did charity work, not just for show. She used her massive platform to support causes she believed in. She was complicated, just like all of us. And speaking of complications, we've only scratched the surface of Georgiana's story. Because while all of this is happening, the gambling, the political work, the miscarriages, the unhappy marriage, another person is about to enter her life who will make everything infinitely more complex. Her name is Lady Elizabeth Foster, and the relationship that develops between Elizabeth, Georgiana, and the Duke is so bizarre, so emotionally tangled, that it is going to take us an entire section to unpack it. We are talking about a love triangle that lasted 24 years, a friendship so intense it might have been romantic, a living arrangement so unconventional that all of England gossiped about it. But that is not even the most scandalous part of Georgiana's life, because eventually she is going to fall truly, desperately in love with a man who is everything her husband is not. And when she gets pregnant with his child, she's going to be forced to make the most heartbreaking choice imaginable. So stay with me, because we are about to dive into one of the strangest domestic arrangements in British history. 3 people, 1 house, secrets, affairs, and a friendship so complicated that even the people living through it could not fully understand it. Trust me, this gets wild. So here is a question I have been thinking about. What would you do if your best friend started sleeping with your husband, Would you throw her out? Cut her off completely? Probably, right? That seems like the normal, healthy response. Now, what if I told you there was a woman who not only accepted this situation, but actually invited her husband mistress to live with them permanently? And that this bizarre arrangement lasted for 24 years, involved multiple children from multiple affairs, and became one of the most gossiped about scandals in British history. Welcome to the absolutely wild story of what happened when Lady Elizabeth Foster entered Georgiana's life. It is 1782, and Georgiana is at one of the lowest points of her life. She's been married for 8 years. She still has not produced a son. Her gambling debts are spiraling. Her husband barely speaks to her. She is 25 years old and already feels like her life is essentially over. So she does what rich, miserable people in the 18th century do. She goes to Bath. Now, Bath is this fashionable spa town where the wealthy go to take the waters, which supposedly have healing properties. But really, it is just an excuse to escape London, meet new people, and pretend your problems do not exist for a few weeks. And that is where Georgiana meets her, Lady Elizabeth Foster, or Bess, as everyone calls her. And from the moment they meet, Georgiana is completely captivated. Let me paint you a picture of Bess, because understanding who she is helps explain how this whole situation unfolds. She is 23 years old, beautiful, charming, and absolutely brilliant at making people feel special. She has this way of looking at you when you talk, like you are the most fascinating person in the entire world. She is educated, witty, and she has this tragic backstory that makes everyone want to protect her. See, Bess is separated from her husband, who by all accounts was genuinely abusive. He has kept her away from her children, which is perfectly legal at the time because fathers own their children the same way they own property. So Bess is essentially destitute, living with her aunt, with no money, no real prospects, and no way to see her own kids. Georgiana hears this story and her heart just breaks. Because remember, Georgiana is deeply lonely. She has money and status, but no real emotional connection with anyone. Her husband does not love her. Her parents are distant. She is desperate for a friend, for someone who actually understands her. And Bess seems perfect. They become inseparable almost immediately. They write each other letters constantly. They share their deepest secrets. Georgiana tells Bess things she has never told anyone, about her gambling, about her miscarriages, about how empty she feels inside, and Bess listens and sympathizes and makes Georgiana feel seen in a way she has never felt before. It is the most intense female friendship either of them has ever had, and there has been speculation among historians for years about whether it was something more than friendship. There are letters between them that use language that seems, well, pretty romantic. They call each other pet names. They write about how they cannot bear to be apart. They talk about their love for each other in ways that make modern readers raise their eyebrows. Were they lovers? We honestly do not know. They might have been. Or it might have just been the way women expressed deep friendship in that era. The truth is probably somewhere in between. An emotional intimacy so intense that the line between friendship and romance became blurry. But here is where the story takes its first really strange turn. Georgiana invites Bess to come stay with her at Devonshire House, just for a little while until Bess gets back on her feet. And the Duke, who barely pays attention to his wife, suddenly becomes very interested in their house guest. Because Bess is not just charming and beautiful, she is also strategic. Some historians think she saw an opportunity and took it. Others think she genuinely cared for both Georgiana and the Duke. The truth is probably a mix of both. William Cavendish, who has shown his wife nothing but coldness for 8 years, starts coming alive around Bess. They have long conversations, they share interests, and pretty soon they are having an affair. Now, you would think this is where Georgiana would kick Bess out, right? This is where the friendship would explode in a dramatic confrontation. But that is not what happens. Instead, the three of them settle into the strangest domestic arrangement you can possibly imagine. They all live together at Devonshire House. All three of them. The Duke, the Duchess, and the Duke's mistress, who is also the Duchess's best friend. And Georgiana not only accepts this, she seems to encourage it. She actively works to keep Bess in their lives. Why? Why would anyone do this? Let me offer you a few theories that historians have debated for decades. Theory number 1. Georgiana is so desperate for emotional connection that she would rather share her husband and keep her best friend than be alone. At least this way, she has someone who actually talks to her, who cares about her feelings, who makes her laugh. The Duke was never going to love her anyway, so what does it matter if he's sleeping with Bess? Theory number 2. Georgiana genuinely loves Bess, possibly romantically, and this arrangement lets her keep Bess close even if she has to share her with William. It is a compromise where everyone gets something they want. Theory number 3. Bess manipulates the situation brilliantly, making herself indispensable to both of them. She becomes the emotional centre of the household, the person both the Duke and Duchess depend on. She is too valuable to lose. Theory number 4, and this one is darker. William essentially forces Georgiana to accept Bess. He has all the power in the marriage. He controls the money. He could divorce Georgiana if he wanted to, and she would lose everything, including access to her children. So maybe Georgiana doesn't really have a choice. Maybe she is making the best of an impossible situation. Personally, I think it is probably a combination of all of these. Human relationships are messy and complicated. And this is one of the messiest, most complicated relationships in history, so they settle into this routine. The three of them, living together, dining together, travelling together, and all of England is absolutely scandalised. The gossip is relentless. Political enemies use the situation to attack the Duke and Georgiana. Cartoonists draw satirical prints showing the three of them in compromising positions. Society ladies whisper behind their fans about the Devonshire House arrangement. But here is what makes this situation even more complicated. Bess gets pregnant, with the Duke's child. She has to leave England to have the baby in secret, because even though everyone knows about the affair, there are still social rules about illegitimate children. She goes to France, has a son named Augustus Clifford, and then comes back to England like nothing happened, and Georgiana welcomes her back with open arms. Then, and I'm not making this up, it happens again, Bess has another baby with the Duke, a daughter this time named Caroline St. Jules. Again she goes away to have the child in secret. Again she comes back. Again Georgiana accepts her. Meanwhile, Georgiana is still struggling to have children of her own. Remember, she has had multiple miscarriages. The pressure to produce an heir is crushing, and here is her husband easily fathering children with her best friend. Can you imagine the emotional torture of that? Watching your husband successfully have children with another woman when you have been trying and failing for years. But then something shifts. Maybe because Bess is there and the household is less tense. Maybe because Georgiana has finally relaxed a little. Maybe just because of timing, but Georgiana gets pregnant, and this time she carries to term. In 1783 she has a daughter. They name her Georgiana, or Little G as the family calls her. 2 years later, another daughter, Harriet. The family is growing, but not in any conventional way. There are Georgiana's daughters. There are Bess's secret children with the Duke, who everyone knows about but no one officially acknowledges. There will eventually be other children in the mix too, but I am getting ahead of myself. The household becomes this strange blend of official and unofficial family. The children all grow up together. Little G and Harriet play with their half-siblings, even though society pretends those children do not exist. And through it all, Georgiana and Bess maintain their intense friendship. The letters between them continue. They support each other through illnesses, through scandals, through grief. But Bess is also using her position. Let me be clear about that. She is not just the Duke's mistress and Georgiana's friend, she is building her own power base. She is making political connections. She is securing her future. She knows that her position in this household is precarious, and she is working every angle to make herself permanent. Some historians paint Bess as this evil manipulator who took advantage of Georgiana's loneliness. Others see her as a woman doing what she had to do to survive in a world that gave women almost no options. A woman who found a way to have influence, security, and even a strange kind of family in a society that would have otherwise thrown her away. And honestly, I think both things can be true. Bess can be manipulative and also genuinely care about Georgiana. She can be using the situation for her own benefit and also providing real emotional support. People are complicated like that. But there is one moment that really shows you how tangled this relationship became. When Georgiana's mother finds out about the arrangement, she is horrified. She writes letters begging Georgiana to send Bess away. She cannot understand how her daughter can tolerate this humiliation. How can you live with your husband's mistress? How can you call her your best friend? And Georgiana writes back defending Bess. She says she cannot imagine life without Bess, that Bess makes her happy, that Bess understands her in a way no one else does. Her own mother cannot compete with the hold Bess has on her. This arrangement continues year after year, through political scandals, through financial crises, through everything. The three of them, locked in this bizarre dance, unable or unwilling to break apart. And here is the really wild part. After Georgiana finally does manage to have a son in 1790, a boy named William but called Hart, you would think maybe the pressure would ease, maybe things would get better, but they do not, because by this point, Georgiana has started looking for happiness outside her marriage too. And that is when she meets the man who will become the great love of her life. The man who will give her the passion and connection she's been craving for years, but also the man who will force her to make an impossible choice that will break her heart into pieces. His name is Charles Grey. And yes, that Grey, the one who will eventually become Prime Minister and have a tea named after him. But when Georgiana meets him, he is just a young, idealistic politician with fire in his eyes and revolutionary ideas in his head. He is everything William is not. Passionate, engaged, alive. And when these two meet, when Georgiana finally experiences what it feels like to be truly wanted by someone, the scandal that has been building for years is about to explode into something far bigger. Because unlike the strange arrangement with Bess, which society could whisper about but technically ignore, what is about to happen with Charles Grey will force everything into the open. We are talking about pregnancy, exile, a child torn from her mother's arms, and a choice so cruel that even centuries later, it makes you want to scream at the unfairness of it all. So take a breath, because the next part of this story is where everything Georgiana has been building, her political influence, her social position, her fragile happiness, comes crashing down in the most devastating way possible. You know that moment when you meet someone and suddenly everything else in your life just fades? When you realize you've been going through the motions for years, and now, finally, you're actually feeling something real. That is what happens when Georgiana meets Charles Grey, and it is going to destroy her. But let me back up a bit, because to really understand why this relationship becomes so significant, you need to understand who Charles Grey is and what he represents to Georgiana. It is around 1788, and Charles Grey is in his mid-20s. He is this passionate, idealistic member of Parliament, deeply involved in the Whig Party that Georgiana has been supporting for years. He is handsome, yes, but that is not what draws her to him. What draws her is his mind, his energy, his absolute conviction that the world can be changed for the better. Charles Grey believes in reform. He wants to expand voting rights to more people, not just wealthy landowners. He speaks out against slavery. He champions the rights of common people. He has fire in his belly and revolution in his eyes. This is a man who actually cares about things, who gets passionate about ideas, who stays up all night debating philosophy and politics. Now compare that to William Cavendish, who cares about his dogs and his mistress and not much else. Can you see why Georgiana would be drawn to Charles Grey? Here is a man who is everything her husband is not. Passionate where William is cold, engaged where William is indifferent, alive where William is just existing. They meet through political circles, of course. The Devonshire House set that Georgiana leads includes most of the important Whig politicians, and Charles is rapidly rising through those ranks. At first, they are just political allies. They talk strategy. They discuss upcoming votes in Parliament. It is all very proper and professional. But somewhere along the way, talking about politics turns into talking about life. Political meetings turn into private conversations. Friendship turns into something much more dangerous. And here is where I need to pause and acknowledge something. What Georgiana is about to do, having an affair, is not admirable. It is going to hurt people. It is going to cause enormous pain. But I also want you to understand the context, because context matters. Georgiana has been married for 14 years at this point. 14 years of rejection, coldness and loneliness. Her husband openly lives with his mistress in the same house. He has fathered 2 children with another woman while Georgiana watched. Society accepts his behaviour without question because he is a man and that is just what men do. But if Georgiana takes a lover, that is unforgivable. That is a scandal. That is grounds for losing everything. The double standard is so blatant it is almost funny. Almost. So when Charles Grey starts paying attention to her, when he looks at her like she matters, when he listens to what she says and treats her opinions as valuable, Georgiana starts to fall. And she falls hard. Their affair probably begins sometime around 1789 or 1790. The exact timing is hard to pin down because, obviously, they were being secretive. But historians can piece together clues from letters, diary entries, and the timing of later events. At first, they are careful. Stolen moments, secret meetings, letters written in code. This is not just romance, this is conspiracy. Because if anyone finds out, the consequences will be catastrophic. But here is the thing about secret affairs. They are incredibly difficult to maintain, especially when you are one of the most famous women in England and your lover is a rising political star. People notice when you disappear at the same time. They notice lingering glances. They notice changes in behaviour. And Bess notices. Remember Bess, the woman living in Georgiana's house raising children with Georgiana's husband? Well, Bess is smart, very smart, and she picks up on the affair fairly quickly. Now, you might expect Bess to expose Georgiana out of revenge or jealousy, but that is not what happens. Instead, Bess actually seems to encourage the relationship. Why would she do that? Some historians think Bess genuinely wants Georgiana to be happy. After all, despite the complicated nature of their relationship, there does seem to be real affection between them. But there is a more cynical interpretation. If Georgiana has an affair, then Bess's position becomes more secure. Georgiana can no longer claim moral high ground about Bess sleeping with William. It levels the playing field. It makes everyone complicit. It ensures that no one can throw anyone else out without massive scandal for everyone involved. Basically, it is mutually assured destruction, which is a weirdly effective way to keep a household together. So Bess keeps the secret. Maybe she even mothers for Georgiana, creating alibis, arranging meetings. The household becomes this web of secrets, with everyone knowing things they are not supposed to know and no one saying anything out loud. And for a while, Georgiana is happier than she has been in years. With Charles, she experiences what love is supposed to feel like. They talk for hours. They share their dreams. He writes her poetry, actual poetry, not just polite compliments. She feels seen, valued, desired in a way she never has before. For the first time since her wedding day, Georgiana feels alive. But here's the problem with forbidden love. It does not stay secret forever. In 1791, Georgiana realizes she is pregnant. Now, on the surface, this should not be a problem. She is married. She already has 3 children with William, the 2 daughters and the son Hart, who was born just the year before. Another pregnancy would be normal, expected even. Except Georgiana knows the truth. And so does Charles. This is not William's child, this is Charles Gray's baby. Can you imagine the panic, the absolute terror of that realization? Because here is what happens if people find out. William can divorce her, and in a divorce she loses everything. Her children, all of them, including the new baby, would stay with William. That is the law. Fathers have absolute custody. A divorced woman has no rights to her own children. None. She would lose her position, her home, her reputation. She would be exiled from society. Her own family would probably disown her out of shame. She would go from being the Duchess of Devonshire, one of the most powerful women in England, to being nothing, less than nothing. And Charles Grey? He might face some criticism, but his career would survive. Men always survive these things. He would move on, maybe marry someone else, keep climbing the political ladder. But Georgiana, she would be ruined, completely and utterly destroyed. So she does what she has to do. She lies. She tells William the baby is his. And William, who has his own reasons for keeping the marriage intact, the scandal would hurt him politically too, accepts this fiction. Or maybe he knows the truth and just does not care. It is hard to say. William Cavendish is not exactly forthcoming about his feelings on anything, but someone does care. Someone who has power over both of them. Someone who can see exactly what is happening and is absolutely not going to let it slide. William's mother, the Dowager Duchess. She is one of those formidable aristocratic matriarchs who rules her family with an iron fist. She knows about Bess and has barely tolerated that situation. She knows about Georgiana's gambling debts and has been furious about those. And now she is starting to suspect there is something going on with Charles Grey. She starts asking questions, making accusations, demanding answers. And then, in late 1791, Georgiana has a miscarriage. The pregnancy ends naturally, and for a brief moment it seems like maybe the crisis is over. Maybe she has dodged this bullet, but she has not. Because William and his mother have now seen the pattern. They know something is going on. They just need proof, so they watch, and they wait. And then, in 1792, Georgiana gets pregnant again. This time there is no doubt. William knows he has not been intimate with Georgiana during the time when conception would have occurred. The timeline does not work. This child is definitely, absolutely not his. The confrontation when it comes is brutal. William gives Georgiana an ultimatum, and I want you to really hear this, because it is one of the cruelest things you can say to a mother. He tells her, "You can give up Charles Grey and the baby, or you can give up me and all your other children." Let that sink in for a moment. She has to choose between the man she loves and the baby they created together, or the 3 children she has already raised and loved for years. Little G is 9 years old, Harriet is 7, Hart is only 2. If she chooses Charles, she will never see those children again, never hold them, never talk to them, never watch them grow up. They will be raised believing their mother abandoned them, and in a very real sense she will have. If she chooses her existing children, she has to give up the man who finally made her feel loved. And she has to give up the baby she is carrying, surrender it immediately after birth to be raised by someone else, knowing she will never be acknowledged as its mother. What would you do? Seriously, put yourself in that position. How do you make that choice? Georgiana chooses her children. The ones she can still hold, still kiss goodnight, still read stories to. She chooses the known over the unknown. She chooses the 3 over the 1. But it breaks her. It absolutely shatters her heart. She has to tell Charles it is over. Can you imagine that conversation? I love you, but I can never see you again. I am carrying your child, but you cannot be part of its life. We have to pretend this never happened. Charles is devastated. Furious, heartbroken, confused, he begs her to reconsider. He offers to give up his political career, to run away with her, to fight William in court. But Georgiana knows better. The law is not on their side, society is not on their side. They have no options that do not end in complete destruction. So she ends it. She cuts him out of her life completely. But she is still pregnant, and now she has to hide. Because even though she is staying with William, even though she is giving up Charles, the scandal would still destroy everything if people found out about the pregnancy. So in early 1792, Georgiana leaves England. The official story is that she is going to France and Italy for her health. Rich people did this all the time, going abroad for a change of climate to recover from vague illnesses. No one questions it too much, but really she is going into exile. She is being sent away to have this baby in secret and then give it up. She travels with a small group of servants and companions, and among them, ironically, is Bess. The woman who is sleeping with her husband is the one keeping her company while she is pregnant with another man's child. If this were fiction, no one would believe it. But it is real. Georgiana spends months in Europe, growing more and more pregnant, becoming more and more depressed. She writes letters home begging to see her children. William refuses. He wants her to understand the consequences of her actions. He wants her to suffer. And she does. Oh, she does. On February 20th, 1792, in a house in the south of France, far from England, far from everyone she loves, Georgiana gives birth to a daughter. She names her Eliza Courtney, and she holds her for maybe a day, maybe 2, just long enough to memorize her feet, to count her fingers and toes, to tell her she is loved even though she will never know why. And then the baby is taken away. Eliza is sent to live with Charles Grey's family. They will raise her as their niece, their ward. The official story is that she is the orphaned daughter of a distant relative. No one will ever tell her the truth about who her real mother is. Georgiana returns to England empty-handed and empty-hearted. She goes back to her husband, to her children, to her life. On the surface, everything returns to normal. The scandal has been contained. The secret has been kept. But Georgiana is never the same. Friends notice she has changed. The spark is gone. She drinks more heavily. She gambles even more recklessly. She throws herself into charity work, maybe trying to atone, maybe just trying to feel something other than grief. And Charles Grey, he never forgets her, never stops loving her. Years later, when he becomes one of the most powerful men in England, when he becomes Earl Grey, when he becomes Prime Minister, He will push through the Reform Act of 1832, expanding voting rights to more people. The very reforms he and Georgiana used to talk about during those secret meetings, and every time he drinks his morning tea, yes, that Earl Grey tea that is named after him, maybe he thinks about her. Maybe he wonders what their daughter looks like. Maybe he regrets that ultimatum, that impossible choice. As for Eliza, she grows up never knowing the truth. She is raised well, she marries, she has her own children, but she never knows that the Duchess of Devonshire, the woman she occasionally sees at social events, the famous lady everyone talks about, is actually her mother. Georgiana watches her daughter from a distance for the rest of her life, sees her at balls and parties, can never say a word, can never claim her, can never hold her again. That is the price she paid for one moment of happiness, for daring to love someone other than the man she was sold to at 17, and the truly heartbreaking part? Georgiana only lives another 14 years after this. She dies in 1806 at age 48, worn out by years of stress, gambling, drinking and grief. She has been dead for over 200 years, and we are still talking about the choice she had to make. But Georgiana's story is just one example of what happened when noble women dared to follow their hearts. Now we are going to cross the North Sea to Denmark, where another young queen is about to make choices that will end even more catastrophically. We are talking about a 15-year-old princess married to a king who is genuinely, clinically insane, a brilliant doctor who will try to save both the king and the kingdom, and a love affair so politically explosive that it will end with one of the most brutal public executions in European history. If you thought Georgiana's story was intense, buckle up, because we are about to meet Caroline Matilda, and her tale is even more tragic. Imagine being 15 years old and being told you're going to marry your cousin, a cousin you have never met, a cousin who lives in a foreign country where you do not speak the language, and then imagine arriving for your wedding and discovering that your new husband is completely, genuinely, terrifyingly insane. That is how Caroline Matilda's story begins, and trust me, it only gets more intense from there. Let me set the scene for you. It is 1766, and Caroline Matilda is a British princess, sister to King George III. She is just 15 years old, think about that, 15, and she's being shipped off to Denmark to marry King Christian VII, who is her first cousin and also 17 years old. On paper, this looks like a great match. Two young royals from powerful families creating an alliance between Britain and Denmark. The wedding is celebrated across Europe. There are parties, fireworks, official portraits. Everyone is thrilled. Everyone except Caroline Matilda, who's about to have the worst wedding night in history. Because Christian VII is not just difficult or immature. He is genuinely mentally ill. Modern historians looking at the historical records believe he probably suffered from schizophrenia, possibly bipolar disorder, maybe some form of personality disorder. Back then, of course, they just said he was eccentric or high-spirited, which is 18th century code for this person is having a mental breakdown and no one knows what to do about it. Let me give you some examples of Christian's behaviour so you understand what Caroline is dealing with. He has violent mood swings that come out of nowhere. One minute he is laughing and joking, the next he is smashing furniture and screaming at servants. He has elaborate fantasies where he thinks he's being persecuted or poisoned. He physically attacks people, including his own advisors and sometimes even Caroline herself. And here is the part that is going to make you incredibly uncomfortable. Christian is obsessed with prostitutes, not just visiting them occasionally, which was unfortunately common for kings at that time, but he is genuinely addicted. He disappears for days at a time to brothels. He brings sex workers back to the palace. He talks about them constantly, describing his experiences in graphic detail to anyone who will listen. including his teenage wife. Can you imagine being 15 years old in a foreign country, married to a man who is clearly unstable and who tells you all about his adventures with other women? Caroline is completely traumatized, absolutely devastated, and she is so young. She is just a kid herself. She should be worrying about normal teenage things, but instead she is trying to survive in a court where her husband is the king, but also completely unpredictable and sometimes violent. The Danish court does not help. They actually make things worse. They strip away the few books she brought from England because they are worried she might get dangerous ideas from reading. As if books are the problem here, not the unhinged king terrorizing everyone. Caroline becomes isolated, depressed, desperate. She has no friends, no family, no one who understands what she is going through. The only thing she is expected to do is produce an heir, which, given Christian's erratic behaviour, is difficult enough. But somehow she does get pregnant, and in 1768 she gives birth to a son, the Crown Prince Frederick. You would think having a son would improve things, right? She has done her duty. She has secured the succession. Maybe now she can have some peace. But no, Christian is getting worse. His mental state is deteriorating rapidly. His advisors are genuinely worried he might hurt someone or completely destroy Denmark's international reputation. They need help. They need someone who can control Christian, calm him down, maybe even cure him. And that is when they meet Dr. Johann Friedrich Struensee. Now, Struensee is not your typical royal physician. He is a German doctor, yes, but he's also a philosopher, a believer in the Enlightenment, a man who thinks society can be improved through reason and science. He's educated, articulate, and most importantly, he has a gift for understanding and managing mental illness. In 1768, Christian goes on a grand tour of Europe, basically a royal road trip to visit other courts and show off how sophisticated Denmark is. Except Christian keeps having public meltdowns, embarrassing Denmark in front of foreign dignitaries. His handlers are panicking. Someone recommends Struensee, who is working in a nearby town. They bring him in to see if he can help manage the king during the tour. And something remarkable happens. Struensee figures out how to handle Christian. He does not try to cure him or change him. He just learns how to calm him down when he's agitated, how to redirect his attention when he is spiraling, how to make him feel safe. Christian, for the first time in his life, has someone who seems to understand him. Christian becomes completely dependent on Struensee, trusts him absolutely. And when the tour ends and they return to Copenhagen, Christian insists that Struensee stay on as his personal physician, so Struensee moves into the royal palace, and that is when he meets the Queen. Caroline Matilda is 18 years old now. She has been married for 2 years, and it has been 2 years of absolute hell. She is lonely, traumatized, probably suffering from depression. She has had a breakdown herself. Historians debate whether it was physical or emotional, but she basically collapsed at one point, and Struensee is called in to treat her. Picture this moment. Caroline is at her lowest point. She feels hopeless, trapped in this nightmare marriage with no way out. And then this doctor walks in. He is calm, intelligent, kind. He actually listens to her. He treats her like a human being instead of just a royal baby-making machine. He speaks to her about ideas, about philosophy, about the world beyond the palace walls. He brings her books, actual books, the things she's been denied. He talks to her about Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Rousseau, about the possibility of creating a better, more rational society. For Caroline, this is like water in a desert. Finally, someone is treating her as an intelligent person. Finally, someone cares about what she thinks and feels. Is it any wonder she falls for him, and he falls for her too? How could he not? Here is this young woman. brave enough to survive an impossible situation, smart enough to understand the ideas he is passionate about, lonely enough to need exactly what he can offer: intellectual connection and emotional support. Their relationship starts as doctor and patient, then it becomes friendship, then it becomes something much more dangerous. Now, I want to pause here and acknowledge something. What is about to happen is adultery. Caroline is married, and even though her husband is terrible, even though the marriage is a disaster, she is still breaking her vows. This is not a simple good guys versus bad guys situation. This is complicated, messy, human. But I also want you to understand the context. Caroline is trapped in a marriage that is destroying her. Divorce is not an option. It would cause an international scandal and she would lose her son. Running away is not realistic. Where would she go? Back to England in disgrace? She has no real options for escape. So when Struensee offers her kindness, respect, intellectual stimulation, and yes, eventually love, she takes it, not because she is wicked or immoral, but because she is a human being desperate for connection. The affair probably begins sometime in 1769 or 1770. They have to be incredibly careful because discovery would mean disaster for both of them. But they find ways to meet privately. They exchange letters. They steal moments together. And something else is happening too. Something that is actually going to change Denmark forever. Remember, Struensee has complete control over Christian. The king trusts him absolutely. So Struensee starts using that influence to make changes, political changes. At first it is small things, improving conditions in hospitals, reforming how the poor are treated, but then he gets more ambitious. He abolishes torture. He establishes freedom of the press. He starts dismantling the power of the old aristocracy and redistributing it to create a more modern, enlightened state. Between 1770 and 1772, Struensee essentially becomes the ruler of Denmark. He is issuing orders in the king's name, and Christian is just signing whatever Struensee puts in front of him. Struensee passes over 2,200 laws in less than 2 years. 2,200. This is revolutionary, literally revolutionary. Denmark is being transformed from a medieval-style kingdom into an Enlightenment state almost overnight, and Caroline is right there with him, supporting these reforms, using her influence as queen to promote his policies. For the first time in her life, she has purpose. She is not just a decorative wife or a baby-making machine. She is helping to change a country for the better. The two of them are intellectually and emotionally in sync. They are partners in this grand project of reform. They are changing the world together, and they are falling deeper and deeper in love. But here is the problem. They are not being as discreet as they think they are. People notice when the Queen and the King's doctor spend a lot of time together. They notice the way Caroline lights up when Struensee enters a room. They notice that Christian seems completely indifferent to what his wife is doing. The rumours start quietly. Whispers at court, gossip in the streets of Copenhagen, but then Caroline does something that makes the rumours impossible to ignore. She starts dressing like a man. I am serious. Caroline gets so confident, so liberated by her new happiness, that she starts wearing men's riding clothes. She rides horses astride like men do, instead of side saddle the way proper ladies are supposed to. She wears scarlet jackets and breeches instead of gowns. For the conservative Danish nobility, this is shocking. This is the Queen of Denmark, and she is dressing like a man and riding around publicly like she does not care what anyone thinks. And maybe she does not care. Maybe for the first time in her life, Caroline feels free. She has love, she has purpose, she has power. Why should she conform to what society expects? But then something happens that makes the scandal impossible to hide. On July 7th, 1771, Caroline gives birth to a daughter. They name her Princess Louise Auguste, and everyone, I mean everyone, knows this child is not Christian's. The timing does not work. Christian has barely been near Caroline for months. The baby looks nothing like the royal family, and besides, the whole court knows about the affair by now. It is the worst kept secret in Denmark. Louise Auguste is Struensee's daughter, and everyone knows it. Now, you might think this is when everything collapses. This is when Caroline and Struensee would be arrested, tried, punished, but incredibly nothing happens. Christian either does not care or does not understand what is going on. He officially accepts Louise Auguste as his daughter. The court has to go along with the official story even though everyone knows the truth. For a few more months, the impossible situation continues. Caroline and Struensee are basically ruling Denmark together while living in an open, secret affair. They are passing reforms, hosting parties, living as if they are invincible. Caroline even creates what people call the Queen's Party, a political faction loyal to her and Struensee. She has actual political power now, something almost unheard of for a woman in 1771. But they have made a critical mistake. They have moved too fast with their reforms. They have angered too many powerful people. The old nobility, the conservative elements of society, the people who lost power when Struensee started his revolutionary changes, they are all plotting revenge. And they have the perfect weapon, the affair itself. Because while Christian might not care about his wife sleeping with his doctor, there are plenty of people who can use that scandal to bring down both Caroline and Struensee. They just need the right moment. That moment comes in the winter of 1772, and when it comes, it is going to be brutal, swift, and absolutely devastating. We are talking about a coup in the middle of the night, a queen arrested in her bedroom, confessions extracted through fear, and a punishment so horrific that it made even hardened executioners sick to their stomachs. The next part of this story is not easy to hear, but it is important, because it shows exactly what happened to women who dared to break the rules, who dared to love the wrong person, who dared to challenge the system. So steel yourself, because we're about to witness the fall of Caroline Matilda and the death of Johann Struensee. There is a specific moment when everything changes, when power shifts, when the people who've been quietly seething in the shadows finally make their move. For Caroline Matilda and Johann Struensee, that moment comes at 4 o'clock in the morning on January 17th, 1772. Let me take you through this night, because it is one of the most dramatic coups in European history, and it happens so fast that Caroline and Struensee barely have time to understand what is happening before their entire world collapses. It is winter in Copenhagen. The court has just finished a lavish masked ball at Christiansborg Palace. These balls are a regular thing, the nobility dressing up in elaborate costumes, dancing until the early hours, drinking heavily. It is all very decadent and fun. Caroline and Struensee have attended together, though they are being somewhat careful not to be too obvious about their relationship. The party winds down around 2 or 3 in the morning. Everyone goes to bed. Caroline is probably in her chambers with her daughter Louise Auguste, who is just 6 months old. Struensee is in his own rooms nearby. Christian is somewhere in the palace, probably passed out drunk or playing with his dogs. Everything seems normal. And then, at 4 in the morning, soldiers burst into the palace. The conspirators have been planning this for months. Led by the Queen Dowager, Christian's mother, and several powerful nobles who hate Struensee's reforms, they have been waiting for the perfect moment. Tonight, they decided, is that moment. They go straight to Christian's bedchamber and wake him up. He is confused, disoriented, probably terrified. These men, including some of his own advisors, surround his bed and start putting papers in front of him. "Sign this, Your Majesty." Christian, who barely understands what is happening, signs. He always signs whatever people put in front of him. That is how Struensee got all those reforms passed, remember? But these are not reforms. These are arrest warrants. One for Struensee, one for his close friend Count Enevold Brandt, who has been helping him, and one for Queen Caroline Matilda. The soldiers move fast. They arrest Struensee first. He probably wakes up to armed men in his room dragging him out of bed. No explanation, no trial, just immediate arrest. They take him away in chains. Then they go for Caroline. Can you imagine? You're 20 years old, you have a 6-month-old baby sleeping next to you, and suddenly soldiers are breaking into your bedroom. You're the Queen of Denmark, and they're treating you like a criminal. They separate her from Louise Auguste immediately. Caroline is screaming, begging to keep her baby, but they rip the infant from her arms. She will never hold her daughter again, ever. They also take away her son, Crown Prince Frederick. He's only 3 years old enough to be confused and frightened, but not old enough to understand why his mother is being taken away. Caroline is begging to see him, to explain, to at least say goodbye. They refuse. Within hours, Caroline is transported to Kronborg Castle. Yes, the same castle that inspired Elsinore in Shakespeare's Hamlet. It is cold, isolated, sitting on the coast north of Copenhagen. It is basically a prison. Struensee and Brandt are taken to even harsher conditions, separate cells, no contact with anyone, no access to lawyers. They're completely cut off. And now the real nightmare begins. The conspirators need confessions. They need Struensee to admit to the affair and to treason. They need Caroline to confess to adultery. Without confessions, this whole coup could backfire. International scandal, diplomatic crisis with Britain, potential civil war. So they apply pressure, psychological torture really. They tell Struensee that Caroline has already confessed and blamed everything on him. They tell him that if he confesses, he might be shown mercy. They imply that if he does not confess, the torture will get much worse. Struensee holds out for a while, but eventually, broken and terrified, he confesses. Yes, he had an affair with the Queen. Yes, he exceeded his authority. He signs a confession admitting to everything. Meanwhile, Caroline is at Kronborg, isolated and desperate. They are using similar tactics on her. They tell her Struensee has confessed and named her as the seductress. They tell her that her brother, King George III of England, has abandoned her and will not help. They tell her that if she does not confess, she will never see her children again. She holds out longer than Struensee. She is tougher than people give her credit for. But eventually the psychological pressure breaks her too. She signs a confession. Yes, she committed adultery with Struensee. Yes, she knew it was wrong. The confessions are exactly what the conspirators needed. Now they can proceed with the trials and punishments without fear of international backlash. After all, both parties have admitted their guilt. The trial, when it happens, is a sham. It is not about justice, it is about revenge and political expediency. They try to charge Struensee with treason for usurping royal authority. But here is the problem. Everything Struensee did, he did with the king's explicit permission. Christian signed every single order, every single reform. So technically, Struensee never committed treason. He was just following the king's wishes. The judges know this. Everyone knows this. But they need a reason to execute him, so they pivot. They charge him with adultery with the Queen instead, which in the legal framework of the time is considered a form of treason, because you are violating the sanctity of the royal bloodline. Never mind that the king had multiple mistresses and illegitimate children. Never mind the obvious double standard. Struensee is a man who dared to sleep with the Queen, and that is unforgivable. Enevold Brandt, his friend, is also condemned to death even though he had nothing to do with the affair. His crime? Being associated with Struensee and supporting his reforms. That is it. The sentence, when it comes, is brutal beyond belief. Struensee and Brandt are to be executed on April 28, 1772. But not just executed, they are going to be tortured to death in public as a warning to anyone else who might dare to challenge the established order. Let me describe what happens, and I warn you, this is genuinely horrific. If you are sensitive to violence, you might want to skip ahead about a minute. On the morning of April 28th, Struensee and Brandt are brought out to the execution ground in Copenhagen. Thousands of people have gathered to watch. Public executions are treated like entertainment in this era, which tells you something marked about human nature. First, their right hands are cut off. While they are still alive and conscious, the executioner severs their hands with an axe, and the crowd watches as they scream in agony. Then they are broken on the wheel. This is a medieval torture device where you are tied to a large wheel and your bones are systematically broken with iron bars. The executioner starts with the legs, then moves up to the arms, the ribs, breaking bone after bone. Only after this prolonged torture are they finally beheaded. Their heads are cut off and placed on spikes. Their bodies are drawn and quartered, literally torn into pieces, and the pieces are left on public display. For 4 years, Struensee's body parts remain on display in Copenhagen as a warning. 4 years of his remains rotting in public view. It is one of the most brutal executions in 18th century Europe, and the message is clear. This is what happens when you try to change things too fast. This is what happens when a commoner dares to love a queen. This is what happens when you challenge the established order. Struensee is 34 years old when he dies. 34. He spent less than 4 years in Denmark, but in that time he tried to transform an entire country, and he paid for it with his life in the most horrific way imaginable. Now, what about Caroline? The conspirators want to execute her too. Some of them are genuinely arguing that she should be beheaded alongside Struensee. She is an adulteress, they say. She betrayed her husband, her country, her sacred duties as queen. But there is a problem. Caroline is not just any woman. She is the sister of the King of England. And while King George III is personally embarrassed and furious about the scandal, he is also not going to sit back and let his sister be executed by a foreign power. Britain sends very clear diplomatic messages to Denmark. If you execute Caroline Matilda, there will be consequences. Military consequences. We will consider it an act of war. Denmark backs down. They cannot afford a war with Britain over this. Instead, they divorce Caroline from Christian. The marriage is annulled. She is stripped of her title as Queen of Denmark. She is officially branded as an adulteress and exiled. But where does she go? She cannot come to England. King George refuses to allow it. She has brought shame on the British royal family, and he wants nothing to do with her. His wife, Queen Charlotte, absolutely refuses to receive her sister-in-law. So Caroline is sent to Chell, a small town in Hanover, which is technically British territory but far enough away that she will not embarrass anyone. She is 21 years old, she has been Queen of Denmark for less than 6 years, and now she is essentially a prisoner for the rest of her life. She lives in Cell Castle with a small household of servants. She is not allowed to leave. She has no official position, no real money of her own, no autonomy. She is completely dependent on the allowance her brother grudgingly provides. And the worst part, she is separated from her children permanently. Crown Prince Frederick stays with his father in Denmark. He grows up being told his mother was a wicked adulteress who betrayed his father. He is taught to be ashamed of her. Louise Auguste, her daughter with Struensee, also stays in Denmark. She will live her entire life officially recognized as Christian's daughter, never publicly acknowledged as Struensee's child. She grows up knowing her mother was exiled in disgrace. Caroline writes letters begging to see them, all denied. She writes to Christian, to her brother, to anyone with power. She pleads for just one visit, one chance to hold her children again. Every request is refused. Can you imagine the grief? The absolute devastation of being separated from your children, knowing they are growing up believing you abandoned them or betrayed them. Caroline spends 3 years in Kiel. Just 3 years. And those years are filled with illness, depression, and heartbreak. In May of 1775, she gets sick. Some kind of fever, possibly scarlet fever, possibly something else. The medical care available to her is limited. She deteriorates quickly. On May the 10th, 1775, Caroline Matilda dies. She is 23 years old. 23. She lived for only 23 years. She was married at 15, queen at 15, mother at 17, disgraced at 20, exiled at 21, and dead at 23. She never saw her children again. She never returned to Denmark. She never experienced the freedom and happiness she briefly had with Struensee. And here is the truly heartbreaking part. Christian, her husband, the man whose mental illness made her life hell, outlives her by 33 years. When he hears about her death, he apparently expresses regret. He says he wishes he could have saved Struensee, that he did not understand what was happening during the coup. Too little, too late. As for the reforms Struensee implemented, most of them are immediately reversed after his execution. The freedom of the press is rescinded. The torture he abolished is reinstated. The progressive policies are dismantled. Denmark goes back to being a conservative aristocratic state. It takes decades before those reforms are tried again. And when they are, historians note that many of them are remarkably similar to what Struensee proposed. He was just too far ahead of his time. So what can we learn from Caroline and Struensee's story? First, that love in impossible circumstances can make you brave enough to try to change the world, but it can also make you reckless enough to endanger everything. Second, that reform is dangerous. When you challenge entrenched power, when you try to make things better too fast, you create enemies who will destroy you if they get the chance. Third, that women always pay a higher price than men for breaking society's rules. Struensee died horribly, yes, but he died with his reforms on the books, with some historical recognition of his achievements. Caroline died in exile, separated from her children, her reputation destroyed, remembered primarily as an adulteress rather than as someone who tried to help create a better Denmark. And fourth, that the 18th century was absolutely brutal to anyone who stepped out of line. But Caroline and Struensee are not the only ones. We are about to cross over to France now, where an even more famous queen is about to face even more vicious attacks. We are talking about the most hated woman in French history, a queen who supposedly said let them eat cake. Spoiler alert, she never said that. But who did have secrets, scandals, and possibly a love affair that has been debated for over 2 centuries. Marie Antoinette is waiting for us, and her story makes Caroline's look almost tame by comparison. Because when the French Revolution comes, when the guillotine starts falling, no one, not even a queen, is safe. If I asked you to name the most famous queen in history, Marie Antoinette would probably be in your top 3, right? Everyone knows her name. Everyone thinks they know her story. The extravagant queen who said, let them eat cake, when told the peasants had no bread. The frivolous woman who bankrupted France with her shopping habits. The villain of the French Revolution. Here is the thing, though. Almost everything you think you know about Marie Antoinette is wrong. She never said, let them eat cake. That quote comes from Jean-Jacques Rousseau's autobiography. written when Marie Antoinette was only 9 years old and still living in Austria. It was attributed to her later as propaganda. She did not bankrupt France. When she arrived in France, the country was already drowning in debt from decades of war and terrible financial management. Her spending, while excessive, was a tiny fraction of the national budget. And she was not French, she was Austrian, which, in 1770, when she arrives in France as a 14-year-old bride, might as well make her an alien from another planet as far as the French people are concerned. Because France and Austria had been enemies for centuries, literally centuries of war, betrayal, and bloodshed. And now, as part of a political alliance, they are sending this Austrian princess to marry the future king of France. The French people are suspicious from day one. Let me paint you a picture of Marie Antoinette's arrival in France, because it is both fascinating and really sad when you understand what is happening. It is May 7th, 1770. Marie Antoinette is 14 years old, just 14. She has been raised in the Austrian court by her mother, Empress Maria Theresa, who is basically training her to be a diplomatic tool. That sounds harsh, but it is true. Marie Antoinette's entire purpose is to cement the alliance between Austria and France through marriage. Her mother has drilled into her head that she must be charming, obedient, and above all she must produce French heirs as quickly as possible to bind the two countries together through blood. So Marie Antoinette leaves Austria and travels to France. But here is the really weird part. At the border between the two countries, there is this elaborate ceremony that is honestly kind of dehumanizing. They build a special pavilion right on the border. Marie Antoinette enters from the Austrian side, and in the middle of this pavilion, she has to strip off all her Austrian clothes, and I mean all of them, down to nothing, and put on French clothes. They even take away her beloved pet dog because it is Austrian. The symbolism is clear. Austria Marie is dying. French Marie is being born. She's supposed to forget her homeland, forget her language. She speaks French with a heavy German accent, and become completely French. She is 14 years old, and they are already erasing her identity. She arrives at Versailles and marries Louis Auguste, who will eventually become King Louis XVI. He is 15 years old, shy, awkward, much more interested in locksmithing and hunting than in his pretty young bride. And here is where Marie Antoinette's nightmare truly begins. The wedding night is a disaster. Louis is so anxious and uncomfortable that he cannot consummate the marriage. And this is not just an embarrassing personal issue, this is a political crisis. The whole point of this marriage is to produce heirs. If there are no heirs, the alliance means nothing, but it gets worse. Louis continues to be unable to consummate the marriage. Night after night, month after month, year after year, there are debates among historians about what the exact problem was. Some think he had a medical condition called phimosis that made intercourse painful. Others think it was psychological. Others think he was just completely uninterested in sex. Whatever the reason, 7 years go by. 7 years of Marie Antoinette being married, but not really married. 7 years of everyone at court gossiping about it. 7 years of enormous pressure to produce an heir when she physically cannot because her husband will not or cannot perform his husbandly duties. Can you imagine the humiliation? The French people are calling her the Austrian woman with contempt. They are saying she is barren, cursed, useless. Political cartoonists are drawing cruel caricatures suggesting she is frigid or defective, and she cannot even defend herself because the truth, that her husband cannot or will not sleep with her, would be even more embarrassing. So what does a lonely, frustrated, 14 then 15 then 16-year-old girl do when she is trapped in this situation? She escapes into pleasure, into parties, fashion, gambling, building her own private world where she can pretend to be happy. And this is where Marie Antoinette makes her first huge mistake. She creates the Petit Trianon. Now, the Petit Trianon is this beautiful small palace on the grounds of Versailles. Louis XV had it built for his mistress, Madame de Pompadour. When Louis XVI becomes king in 1774, he gives it to Marie Antoinette as a gift. On paper, this is sweet, a husband giving his wife her own space. But in practice, it becomes a public relations disaster, because Marie Antoinette turns the Petit Trianon into her private escape. She invites only her chosen friends. She relaxes the strict etiquette rules that govern Versailles. People can dress casually, speak freely, just be normal human beings instead of performing courtly roles all the time. For Marie Antoinette, this is freedom. This is her one place where she can breathe, where she does not have to be the Austrian woman, or the future queen, or the disappointing wife who has not produced an heir. She can just be herself. But to the French people, to the nobles who are not invited, to the public who hears about these exclusive parties, it looks like the queen is being secretive, exclusive, elitist. What is she doing in there that requires such privacy? Who is she spending time with? What are they plotting? The rumours start immediately. Scandalous rumours that Marie Antoinette is having wild orgies at the Petit Trianon, that she is having lesbian affairs with her close friends, particularly the Duchesse de Polignac, that she is wasting enormous amounts of money on decorations and parties while French people are starving. Some of these rumours have tiny grains of truth wrapped in massive exaggerations. Yes, Marie Antoinette spends a lot of money on the Petit Trianon, but not nearly as much as the rumours suggest. Yes, she has intense friendships with women that might have had romantic elements, but the wild orgies, complete fabrication. Yet the rumours spread like wildfire because they fit a narrative that people want to believe. The Austrian foreigner is corrupting France, the Queen is immoral, the monarchy is decadent, and then comes the affair of the diamond necklace in 1785, which is so bizarre and complicated that it sounds like a bad novel plot, but it really happened. Here is the short version. There is this incredibly expensive diamond necklace worth about 1.6 million livres, that is roughly 15 million US dollars today. A group of con artists, led by a woman named Jeanne Delamotte, convinces a cardinal that Marie Antoinette secretly wants to buy this necklace, but cannot do so publicly. The cardinal, who is desperate to get back into the Queen's good graces after she snubbed him, agrees to act as an intermediary. He buys the necklace on credit, thinking he's doing the Queen a favour. The con artists take the necklace, break it apart, sell the diamonds, and disappear with the money. When the jewellers come demanding payment, the whole scheme unravels. And even though Marie Antoinette had absolutely nothing to do with it, even though she was the victim of identity theft basically, the public blames her. Why? Because by this point, 1785, the narrative about Marie Antoinette is set in stone. She is Madame Déficit, the queen who is bankrupting France. So of course she must have wanted that ridiculously expensive necklace. Of course she must have been involved in this scheme. It fits the story everyone already believes. The cardinal is put on trial. He is acquitted because it becomes clear he was duped. But the damage to Marie Antoinette's reputation is catastrophic. The trial is public. All the details come out. And even though she is proven innocent, the public has already decided she is guilty. This is when the political cartoons become really vicious. They start depicting her as a monster, a harpy, a greedy foreigner sucking France dry. The pornographic pamphlets get distributed. Yes, actual pornographic pamphlets showing Marie Antoinette in degrading sexual situations. These are being sold on the streets of Paris. This is character assassination on a massive coordinated scale. And Marie Antoinette has no good way to fight back because defending yourself from rumours just makes you look guilty. Meanwhile, her personal life finally improves a little. In 1777, after 7 years of marriage, Louis finally consummates the marriage. Historians think he might have had minor surgery to correct that medical issue, or maybe he just finally got over his psychological hang-ups. Whatever happened, it works. Marie Antoinette gets pregnant, and in December of 1778, she gives birth to her first child, a daughter named Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, but called Madame Royale. You would think this would help her popularity. She has done her duty. She has produced a royal child. But no, people are disappointed it is not a boy. And the rumours continue. In 1781, she has a son, the Dauphin Louis-Joseph. Finally, a male heir. This should quiet the critics. It does not. By now, the propaganda machine is too powerful. Nothing Marie Antoinette does can repair her image. And here is the really tragic part. While all this is happening, while she is being destroyed in the court of public opinion, Marie Antoinette is actually becoming a more serious, more mature person. After having children, she becomes less frivolous. She spends more time on charitable work, she visits hospitals, she donates to the poor, she takes her role as queen more seriously. But none of this gets reported. The newspapers and pamphlets are only interested in scandal. They want stories about her excess, her affairs, her betrayal of France. So that is what they publish, whether it is true or not. By 1789, when the French Revolution begins, Marie Antoinette's reputation is so thoroughly destroyed that she has become a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. Not because of what she actually did, but because of what people believe she did. Let me be clear about something. Marie Antoinette was not a perfect person. She was spoiled, she was tone-deaf to the suffering of common people. She did spend too much money on luxuries while France struggled economically. These are fair criticisms. But she was also a scapegoat. A convenient target for rage that was really about decades of terrible governance, economic inequality, and social injustice that had nothing to do with her. She was 14 when she arrived in France. 14. A child bride in a foreign country, married to a man who could not or would not touch her for 7 years, blamed for problems that existed before she was born, turned into a monster by propaganda. And we have not even gotten to the most controversial part of her story yet. Because while all this is happening, while Marie Antoinette is being transformed from a person into a symbol of everything wrong with France, someone else enters her life. A Swedish count, handsome, charming, devoted, someone who will stay loyal to her even when everyone else abandons her, someone whose relationship with hers will be debated by historians for over 2 centuries. Was Axel von Fersen her lover? The father of one or more of her children? Her one true love? Or just a devoted friend caught up in romantic speculation? Modern science has actually provided some surprising answers to these questions. We are talking about X-ray technology revealing censored love letters, timing analysis of pregnancies, physical resemblances that are hard to ignore. The evidence is pretty compelling, and it is going to change how you see Marie Antoinette's final years. Because in the middle of all this political chaos, all this public hatred, she might have found the one thing that made it all bearable. Real love, with someone who actually saw her as a person, not a symbol or a diplomatic tool. So let us meet Count Axel von Fersen and discover what modern science has finally revealed about one of history's most debated royal romances. Sometimes the most important relationships in our lives begin with the simplest moments. A glance across a crowded room, a conversation that lasts just a little too long, a feeling that this person, this stranger, somehow stands you in a way no one else does. For Marie Antoinette and Count Axel von Fersen, it all started at a masked ball in January 1774. She was 18 years old, already frustrated in her unconsummated marriage. He was also 18, a Swedish aristocrat on his grand tour of Europe. They talked for a long time that night, both wearing masks, both pretending to be people they were not. It was carnival season, where normal rules were suspended and everyone could be whoever they wanted to be. Just two young people talking and laughing, not a queen and a count, but just two people, and then the masks came off. Now here is where the story gets interesting, because Axel von Fersen does not immediately become Marie Antoinette's lover. This is not some instant scandalous affair. Instead, it is a slow burn that takes years to develop, which actually makes it more believable and more tragic. After that first meeting, Fersen leaves France. He goes to England to continue his education, then returns briefly to Sweden. They do not see each other for 4 years. 4 years where Marie Antoinette is still trapped in that terrible situation with Louis, still unable to consummate her marriage, still lonely and desperate for real connection. And then, in July 1778, Fersen returns to Versailles. Marie Antoinette recognizes him immediately, and according to witnesses who were there, her face lights up. She exclaims, "Ah, it is an old acquaintance. Now, on the surface, this seems like just a polite greeting, but think about the context." Marie Antoinette meets hundreds of people. The French court is constantly full of nobles, diplomats, visitors. She would not remember most of them, especially not someone she met once 4 years ago at a masked ball. But she remembers him, and she is happy to see him. Fersen starts spending time at Versailles, becoming part of Marie Antoinette's inner circle, and people notice. The Swedish ambassador to France, Gustav Philipp Kreutz, writes a letter to the King of Sweden in 1778. Let me quote it directly because it is pretty telling. The young Count Fersen has been so well received by the Queen that this has given umbrage to several persons. I own that I cannot help thinking that she had a liking for him. Umbrage. That is diplomat speak for people are gossiping and getting jealous. The ambassador can see what is happening. Marie Antoinette is attracted to Fersen, very attracted. And Fersen? He writes to his father describing Marie Antoinette as the most amiable princess that I know. He gets permission to attend her private gatherings at the Petit Trianon, which, remember, is her exclusive retreat where only chosen friends are invited. They are spending a lot of time together, talking, probably flirting, definitely developing feelings. But then something happens that forces them apart. In 1780, Fersen leaves France to fight in the American Revolution. He becomes an aide-de-camp to General Rochambeau, commanding French forces helping the American colonies fight for independence from Britain. And why does he leave right when things are getting intense with Marie Antoinette? Some historians think he left specifically to avoid causing a scandal. The attraction between them was becoming too obvious, too dangerous. Better to leave before something happened that could destroy both their reputations. So Fersen goes to America and fights in the Revolutionary War. He is actually present at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781 when the British surrender. Pretty significant historical moment. Meanwhile, back in France, Marie Antoinette's life is changing too. Because finally in 1777, Louis manages to consummate their marriage, and Marie Antoinette starts having children, first the daughter in 1778, then the son Louis Joseph in 1781. When Fersen returns to France in June of 1783, Marie Antoinette is pregnant again, with her second son, who will be born in March 1785, and named Louis Charles. Now, this is where modern science enters the story in a really fascinating way. Historians have debated for over 2 centuries whether Marie Antoinette and Fersen were actually lovers or just devoted friends. The evidence was always circumstantial. They spent a lot of time together. They clearly cared deeply for each other. They wrote letters using code names. But there was no definitive proof until 2021. In 2021, a team of scientists in France used X-ray fluorescent spectroscopy, basically a technology that can detect different chemical compositions in ink, to read words that had been deliberately censored in letters between Marie Antoinette and Fersen. These letters had been copied by Fersen himself and kept in his personal archives, but certain words and phrases had been carefully scribbled out, redacted, made illegible. For over 150 years, historians had wondered what those censored words said. Now, thanks to X-ray technology, we finally know the censored words include beloved, tender friend, adore, and madly. Let me give you an example. One letter from Marie Antoinette to Fersen originally read something like, "I am going to finish my censored because I am overcome with sleep. I love you madly, and I could not for one moment stop adoring you." The censored word, beloved. No queen uses the word beloved lightly to a man who is not her husband. This is not casual friendship language. This is not how you write to your political advisor or your dance instructor. This is love letter language. And here is the crucial detail. The person who censored these letters was Fersen himself. He kept copies of their correspondence, but before he died, he went through and carefully redacted the most passionate, most incriminating phrases. Why would he do that? Because he knew these letters could fall into the wrong hands. He knew they were evidence of something that could have gotten Marie Antoinette executed. And remember, she was eventually executed, though not for this. He was protecting her even after her death. But the X-ray technology does not lie. The words are there, hidden under the scribbles. Beloved, adore, madly. This is a love affair. No question. But it gets even more interesting, because there is also the question of children. Marie Antoinette has 4 children total. The first daughter, Marie-Thérèse, born in 1778, when Fersen was just becoming close to her. The first son, Louis-Joseph, born in 1781 while Fersen was in America. The second son, Louis-Charles, born in 1785. And a second daughter, Sophie, born in 1786, who sadly died in infancy. Now, historians have always wondered about the paternity of the younger children, especially Louis-Charles, who would later be known as Louis XVII during the Revolution. Here is what we know. Fersen returned to France in June of 1783. Marie Antoinette was already pregnant at that time, but she had a miscarriage in November of 1783. Then during the week of June 23rd through June 30th, 1784, exactly 9 months before Louis-Charles was born, something significant happened. The King of Sweden was visiting France for the first time. Marie Antoinette hosted an elaborate party at the Petit Trianon in his honour. And guess who was in the Swedish king's entourage? Axel von Fersen, who had been away from Versailles for 10 months. Fersen had his own apartment at the Petit Trianon, directly above Marie Antoinette's rooms. The head of the royal guard later reported that when Fersen was at the Petit Trianon, he would stay for days at a time, and that Louis knew about it but did not seem to care. 9 months after that week in June 1784, Louis-Charles was born, March 27th, 1785. Now, could Louis XVI be the father? Possibly. He was Marie Antoinette's husband after all. But here is the interesting thing. Before Fersen returned in 1783, it took Marie Antoinette 7 years to have her first child, then 3 more years to have her second. That is 2 pregnancies in 10 years. But within a month of Fersen returning, she goes from 2 pregnancies in 10 years to having 3 pregnancies in 3 years. The first ended in miscarriage, but then came Louis Charles and then Sophie. The timing is suggestive, to say the least, and people at the time noticed. There were whispers that Louis Charles did not look like the rest of the royal family, that he bore a striking resemblance to Fersen instead. In 2019, a French geneticist claimed to have proven through DNA testing of preserved hair samples that Louis XVI was definitely Louis Charles's father. But other scientists have questioned that study's methodology and sample authenticity. The debate continues. Personally, based on all the evidence, the love letters, the timing, the eyewitness accounts, the physical resemblance, I think there is a very strong case that Fersen and Marie Antoinette were lovers, and that he might have fathered at least one of her children. But here is what really matters. Whether or not they had a physical affair, they definitely had an emotional one. And in many ways, that is even more significant. Fersen wrote in his diary about a woman he called Elle, which is French for she. He wrote about how much he loved Elle, how he thought about her constantly, how he could never marry anyone else because his heart belonged to her. Everyone who has read these diary entries agrees that Elle is Marie Antoinette. Fersen never names her directly because he's being discreet, but the context makes it obvious. In one entry he writes he cannot marry because I cannot belong to the only person I want to belong to, the only one who truly loves me. That is heartbreaking, because he is right. He cannot belong to her. She is married to the King of France. Oh, any relationship between them is forbidden, dangerous, impossible. But they continue it anyway, for years. Through all the mounting political tensions, through the early days of the revolution, through everything. Marie Antoinette trusts Fersen completely. She writes to him about her fears, her frustrations, her desperation. When she needs advice, she turns to him. When she needs comfort, he provides it. And when the revolution truly explodes, when the royal family is in genuine danger, Fersen does not abandon her like almost everyone else does. He stays loyal. He risks his life trying to help her. But before we get to that final tragic chapter, I want you to understand what this relationship meant to Marie Antoinette. For most of her life, she had been treated as an object, a diplomatic tool to cement an alliance between Austria and France, a womb to produce French heirs, a symbol of everything wrong with the monarchy. But with Fersen, she was just Marie, not Marie Antoinette the Queen, not the Austrian woman, not Madame Deficit, just a person who loved and was loved in return. In the middle of all the hatred, all the propaganda, all the pressure, she had this one relationship that was real, this one person who saw her as a human being. That is why the letters are so passionate. That is why she used words like beloved and adore and madly. Because for the first time in her life, she was experiencing what it felt like to be genuinely loved for who she was, not for what she represented. And Fersen felt the same way. He turned down multiple opportunities to marry wealthy, suitable women. His family begged him to settle down, produce heirs, do his aristocratic duty. He refused, because his heart belonged to someone he could never have. It is one of the great tragic romances of history, not because it is a fairy tale, but because it is real. Two people who genuinely loved each other, but were kept apart by circumstances beyond their control. And when the French Revolution starts tearing everything apart, when the mob is literally storming Versailles, when Marie Antoinette's life is in mortal danger, Fersen is going to do everything in his power to save her. He is going to organize an escape attempt so daring, so elaborate that it almost works. And when it fails, when everything falls apart in the worst possible way, the consequences are going to seal Marie Antoinette's fate. Because that failed escape attempt the flight to Varennes as it becomes known, turns the French people's anger into absolute fury. It proves in their minds that the king and queen are traitors trying to flee the country and bring foreign armies back to crush the revolution. From that point on, there is no forgiveness, no mercy, no way back. The guillotine becomes inevitable, and through it all, Axel von Fersen will remain devoted to the woman he loves, even when everyone else has abandoned her, even when trying to help her means risking his own life, even when there is no hope left at all. There are moments in history where everything changes in a single night, where the world you went to sleep in is completely different from the world you wake up to. For Marie Antoinette, that night is October 5th, 1789. The French Revolution has been building for months. The Bastille fell in July. The streets of Paris are filled with angry mobs demanding bread, demanding change, demanding blood, but Versailles, that glittering palace 12 miles outside the city, has remained relatively safe. The royal family is still there, still going through the motions of courtly life, still hoping this will somehow blow over. They are living in a fantasy, and that fantasy is about to shatter violently. On October 5th, thousands of women, and I mean thousands, estimates range from 7 to 10,000, march from Paris to Versailles. They are angry about bread shortages, about high prices, about the fact that they are starving while the royals live in luxury. They are armed with pikes, axes, muskets. This is not a peaceful protest, this is a mob. They arrive at Versailles in the afternoon and demand to see the king. Louis, completely out of his depth as always, agrees to meet with some representatives. He promises to send grain to Paris. He tries to calm them down, but the crowd does not disperse. They camp outside the palace all night, and as the night goes on, they get angrier, drunker, more violent. At around 5 in the morning on October 6th, some of the mob breaks into the palace. They are hunting for the Queen. They want Marie Antoinette specifically. They are shouting, "We will kill the Austrian! We will cut off her head!" Marie Antoinette wakes up to the sound of her guards being murdered outside her bedroom. One of her ladies-in-waiting rushes in and screams at her to run. Marie Antoinette flees in her nightgown, barefoot, running through the secret passages of Versailles, while the mob tears through her rooms looking for her. They do not find her. She makes it to the king's chambers, but it is terrifyingly close. If she had been 30 seconds slower, if that lady-in-waiting had not woken her in time, Marie Antoinette would have been killed that night. Eventually Lafayette, the general who helped win the American Revolution and is now trying to maintain order in France, manages to calm the mob down, but the price is this. The royal family must return to Paris. They must leave Versailles and move to the Tuileries Palace in the centre of the city, where the people can watch them. This is essentially house arrest. They are prisoners now, even if no one is saying it out loud. The royal family is forced to ride in a carriage back to Paris, surrounded by the mob. The women who march to Versailles are carrying the heads of the murdered guards on pikes. They are singing and celebrating. This is their victory parade. Marie Antoinette sits in that carriage with her children, watching this nightmare unfold, knowing that her life as she knew it is over. And where is Fersen during all this? He is in Sweden on diplomatic business, and when he hears what happened, he is absolutely frantic. He immediately starts making plans to return to France, to help her, to do something. The next year and a half is a slow-motion disaster. The royal family is trapped in Paris. They are constantly watched. Their movements are restricted. Revolutionary newspapers publish increasingly vicious attacks on Marie Antoinette, calling her everything from a prostitute to a traitor to a monster. And the royal family knows, they know, that if they stay in France, they will eventually be killed. The revolution is getting more radical by the day. The moderates are losing control to the extremists. It is only a matter of time before someone demands the king and queen be put on trial. They need to escape, but how? This is where Fersen re-enters the story in a big way, because he is the one who organises what becomes known as the flight to Varennes, the royal family's desperate attempt to flee France. The plan is elaborate, maybe too elaborate. Here is how it is supposed to work. On the night of June 20th, 1791, the royal family will sneak out of the Tuileries Palace in disguise. They will travel by carriage to the northeastern border of France near Austria, where royalist military units are waiting to protect them. Once safely across the border, they can regroup, gather support from other European monarchies, and potentially return to France with an army to restore order. Fersen spends months planning every detail. He arranges the carriage, a huge, expensive, highly conspicuous carriage that should have been a red flag right there. He coordinates with the military units. He creates a cover story. He risks his life repeatedly sneaking in and out of Paris to finalize the arrangements. And Marie Antoinette trusts him completely. She puts her life, her children's lives, her husband's life in Fersen's hands. The night of the escape, June 20th, 1791, starts off successfully. Fersen himself drives the carriage for the first part of the journey, disguised as a coachman. He gets them out of Paris without being detected. It is working. But then Fersen has to leave them. He cannot accompany them the whole way without raising suspicion, so he says goodbye to Marie Antoinette, probably for what they both fear might be the last time, and turns the driving over to others. And this is where everything starts to go wrong. The carriage is too slow. It is so heavy and ornate that it cannot travel fast enough to stay ahead of pursuit. They fall behind schedule. The military units that are supposed to meet them at various points along the route are not where they are supposed to be. Either they left too early, thinking the royal family was not coming, or they never got the messages about the exact timing. The disguises are not good enough. Louis is a terrible actor. He keeps doing things that draw attention. At one point he leans out of the carriage window to look at something and someone recognizes his profile from the coins. And here is the critical mistake. They stop in the town of Saint-Menehould to change horses, and the postmaster there, a man named Jean-Baptiste Drouet, recognizes Louis. He is almost certain that this servant in the carriage is actually the king. Drouet races ahead to the next town, Varennes, and organizes a roadblock. When the royal carriage arrives in Varennes around 11 at night on June 21st, they are stopped, questioned, identified. The King of France has been caught trying to flee the country. Can you imagine the despair? They were so close, just 30 miles from the border, 30 miles from safety. If they had been in a faster carriage, if the military units had been positioned correctly, if they had not stopped in Saint-Menehould, they might have made it. But they did not make it, and the consequences are catastrophic. News spreads across France like wildfire. The king tried to abandon the revolution. He tried to flee to Austria, Marie Antoinette's homeland, to get foreign armies to invade France. This proves in the minds of the revolutionaries that the royal family are traitors. The assembly sends representatives to bring them back to Paris. The return journey is a nightmare. Crowds gather along the route, shouting insults, throwing things at the carriage. The hatred is palpable. When they arrive back in Paris on June 25th, the city is dead silent. No one cheers, no one bows, they just stare with cold contempt. The monarchy has lost whatever remaining goodwill it had. From this point on, there is no going back. The assembly suspends the king's powers. They are definitely prisoners now, and the calls for putting them on trial, for executing them, grow louder every day. Marie Antoinette writes to Fersen in secret using code and invisible ink. She tells him, "Our position is dreadful, but do not worry too much. I am taking heart, and I have something inside me that tells me that we will soon be happy and saved." She is trying to stay hopeful, but it is false hope. She has to know on some level how bad this is. Fersen is beside himself. He blames himself for the failure of the escape. If he had planned better, if he had chosen a different route, if he had stayed with them longer. He starts desperately trying to organize another rescue attempt, contacting foreign governments, looking for any way to save her. But time is running out. In August of 1792, revolutionaries storm the Tuileries Palace again. This time they are not just demanding concessions, they are demanding the end of the monarchy entirely. The royal family barely escapes with their lives and is moved to the Temple Tower, a medieval fortress in Paris that becomes their prison. The conditions are harsh, they are watched constantly, their every movement is monitored. They are allowed almost no privacy, no dignity. Marie Antoinette's son, the boy who might be Fersen's child, is eventually taken away from her and put in the care of revolutionary guards who deliberately mistreat him to cure him of his aristocratic habits. In December of 1792, Louis XVI is put on trial for treason. The verdict is predetermined. He is found guilty and sentenced to death. On January 21st, 1793, Louis is executed by guillotine. Marie Antoinette is forced to listen to the preparations, the drums, the crowds gathering from her prison cell. She cannot see it happen, but she knows. She knows her husband is being killed. Now she is alone, widowed, imprisoned, and she knows she is next. Fersen, when he hears about Louis's execution, redoubles his efforts to save Marie Antoinette. He contacts every powerful person he knows. He offers bribes. He tries to organize military interventions. He is desperate, willing to do anything. But nothing works. The revolutionary government is not interested in negotiation. They want Marie Antoinette dead. She has become a symbol of everything they are fighting against. The Austrian woman who supposedly corrupted France, the spendthrift who bankrupted the nation, the traitor who tried to flee to her homeland. None of it is quite true, but truth does not matter anymore. The revolution has created its own narrative, and Marie Antoinette is the villain. In August of 1793, she is moved from the Temple Tower to the Conciergerie prison. This is where they take people who are about to be executed. Everyone knows what this means. Her trial, when it finally happens in October, is even more of a sham than Louis's. The charges are absurd. They accuse her of sending French gold to Austria, of plotting with foreign enemies, and in the most disgusting accusation they charge her with sexually abusing her own son. This last charge is so vile, so obviously fabricated, that even some of the revolutionaries are uncomfortable with it. But they include it anyway because they want to destroy her completely. Not just kill her, but destroy her reputation so thoroughly that no one will mourn her. Marie Antoinette's response to this accusation is one of the few moments where her dignity shines through. She stands up in the courtroom and says, "If I have not responded, it is because nature itself refuses to answer such a charge against a mother. I appeal to all mothers present." Even in the hostile courtroom, this creates a moment of silence, because everyone knows this is a lie. Everyone knows they are destroying an innocent woman. But it does not matter. She is found guilty, sentenced to death. The execution is scheduled for October 16th, 1793. The night before her execution, Marie Antoinette writes a letter to her sister-in-law. It is her last letter, and it is heartbreaking. She writes about her children, about her hope that they will be taken care of. She forgives her enemies. She expresses her faith in God. She does not mention Fersen directly, of course, but there is a line that historians think might be about him. She writes about the pain of being separated from all those dear to my heart, all those dear to her heart. the children she will never see again, and maybe, just maybe, the Swedish count who loved her when no one else just did. On the morning of October 16th, 1793, Marie Antoinette is taken from her cell. Her hair has turned white from stress. She is only 37 years old but looks decades older. She is dressed in a plain white dress, her hands tied behind her back. They put her in a cart, not even a carriage, just an open cart like they use for common criminals, and parade her through the streets of Paris to the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine waits. Thousands of people line the streets to watch. Some are shouting insults, some are silent. A few brave souls bow or make the sign of the cross, risking their own lives to show respect. Marie Antoinette sits in that cart with perfect composure. She does not cry, she does not beg. She maintains her dignity even when everything else has been taken from her. At the guillotine, she accidentally steps on the executioner's foot while climbing the scaffold. Her last words are, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Even facing death, she remembers her manners. The blade falls at 12:15 in the afternoon. The executioner holds up her severed head to the crowd. They cheer, they celebrate, they think they've killed a monster, but all they've really killed is a woman. A complicated, flawed human woman who was born into a role she never asked for, who became a scapegoat for problems she did not create, who found love in impossible circumstances and paid the ultimate price for daring to be more than the symbol everyone wanted her to be. And Fersen? When he learns of her execution the day after it happens, he writes in his diary, "I could only think of my loss. I have lost everything I had in this world. The one I loved so much, for whom I would have given my life 1,000 times over, is no more." He never marries, never moves on. For the next 17 years, he lives with that grief. And in 1810, in a cruel twist of fate, Fersen himself is killed by an angry mob in Stockholm during political unrest. He is beaten to death in the street, much like the guards at Versailles were killed the night Marie Antoinette fled for her life. It is as if history decided they should have similar fates. Both victims of mob violence, both dying because they were caught in the crossfire of political chaos they could not control. Their story does not have a happy ending, but it is real. And maybe that is what makes it matter, because it shows us that even in the worst circumstances, even when the world is literally falling apart around you, love can still exist, loyalty can still exist, dignity can still exist. Marie Antoinette and Axel von Fersen were not perfect people, but they were real people who loved each other, in a time when that love was forbidden and dangerous and ultimately tragic. And they are not the only ones. History is full of women who broke the rules, who defied expectations, who chose love or power or freedom over safety. Some of them wore men's clothes and fought duels. Some became pirates. Some were crowned after death. Their stories are wild, shocking, and completely true. So let us meet some of these other remarkable rule breakers who scandalized their societies in ways that make even Georgiana, Caroline, and Marie Antoinette look almost conventional by comparison. Let me ask you something. When you think about women breaking rules in the 17 and 1800s, what comes to mind? Love affairs, political intrigue, maybe gambling debts? Well, how about this? A princess who settled an argument about flower arrangements by fighting a duel in her corset. 2 female pirates who terrorized the Caribbean and fought alongside men so fiercely that even hardened sailors were afraid of them. A Portuguese noblewoman who was stabbed to death, then exhumed years later, dressed in royal robes, crowned as queen, and her corpse forced to receive the homage of the entire court. Yes, these are all real, and they are just the beginning. Because while Georgiana, Caroline, Matilda, and Marie Antoinette were breaking rules in relatively predictable ways, affairs, politics, gambling, there were other women out there who looked at society's expectations and said, "You know what, I am going to do something absolutely wild instead." Let me introduce you to some of the most audacious rule breakers in history. First up, Princess Pauline von Metternich. And I want you to understand right away that this woman was already a force of nature before the duel. She was one of the most influential women in the 19th century Vienna, a patron of the arts, a fashion icon married to the Austrian ambassador to France. She threw parties that made Marie Antoinette's gatherings at the Petit Trianon look tame. But in 1892, when Pauline is in her 50s, yes, 50s, she gets into an argument with Countess Hielmansegg. And what are they arguing about? National security? Political philosophy? The rights of women? No, they are arguing about flower arrangements. I am not kidding. They are planning some kind of charity event or exhibition, and they disagree about how the flowers should be arranged. The argument escalates. Words are exchanged, and Pauline, being Pauline, decides there is only one way to settle this like honourable aristocrats: a duel. Now, women fighting duels was extremely rare but not completely unheard of. What makes this duel absolutely legendary is how they decide to do it. They strip down to their corsets. Why? Because Pauline's physician, a woman, yes, a female doctor in 1892, which is also remarkable, advises them that if they fight in their regular clothes and get cut, the fabric might cause infection. So the logical solution is to duel in their underwear. So you have two aristocratic women in their 50s, standing in a garden or private room somewhere, wearing nothing but their corsets, holding swords or possibly pistols depending on which account you read, ready to fight to the death over floral arrangements. This actually happens. Pauline gets wounded, a cut on her nose, but both women survive, and the scandal is enormous, because no matter how you spin it, two princesses fought a duel in their underwear over flowers. That is breaking the rules in the most spectacular way possible. But at least Pauline was raised as nobility and breaking rules from a position of privilege. What about women who broke so many rules they had to completely reinvent themselves? Let me tell you about Mary Read and Anne Bonny, the two most notorious female pirates of the 18th century. Mary Read's story starts in England in the late 1600s. She is born illegitimate, which already puts her at a disadvantage. Her mother dresses her as a boy to deceive her husband's family into supporting them. So Mary grows up living as a boy, wearing boys' clothes, doing boys' work. And she discovers she likes it. She likes the freedom. She likes not being constrained by women's clothing and women's expectations. So even after she is old enough to know better, she keeps dressing as a man. She joins the British Army as a man. She fights in battles. She becomes a soldier. Can you imagine the constant fear of being discovered? One accident, one injury requiring medical treatment, and her secret is exposed. Eventually she falls in love with a fellow soldier, reveals her true identity to him, and they get married. Finally, she can live as a woman, right? Wrong, her husband dies. And Mary, faced with the choice of going back to being a poor woman with no prospects, or continuing to live as a man with opportunities and freedom, chooses freedom. She disguises herself again and signs on as a sailor on a merchant ship, and that ship gets attacked by pirates. The pirates capture the ship and give the crew a choice: join us or die. Mary joins them, and she becomes a pirate. Now she is part of Calico Jack Rackham's crew, one of the most famous pirate crews in the Caribbean. And on that crew is another woman disguised as a man, Anne Bonny. Anne Bonny's story is almost as wild. She is born in Ireland to a wealthy lawyer father who moves the family to the American colonies. She grows up privileged but wild. She supposedly stabs a servant girl with a table knife during an argument. She marries a small-time pirate against her father's wishes. He disowns her. So Anne says, "Fine, I will just become a pirate myself." She meets Calico Jack Rackham, leaves her husband and joins Jack's crew. She dresses as a man, fights as a man, lives as a man, and she is good at it, really good. Witnesses who survived encounters with her crew say she was one of the fiercest fighters, always in the thick of battle, showing no mercy. When Mary Red joins the crew, these two women recognise something in each other. Some accounts say Anne was attracted to Mary while still thinking Mary was a man. Other accounts say they became friends and confidants, the only two women in a world of brutal male pirates. What we know for sure is that they fought side by side. When the British Navy finally captured Calico Jack's crew in 1720, witnesses reported that when the pirates were drunk below deck, it was Mary Red and Anne Bonny who stayed on deck, fighting desperately to defend the ship. Two women out fighting an entire crew of men, they are captured, put on trial, sentenced to hang. But here is the twist. Both Mary and Anne reveal they are pregnant, and British law says you cannot execute a pregnant woman because you would be killing an innocent unborn child, so they get a reprieve. Mary Red dies in prison of fever in 1721, still pregnant, never having faced the noose. She is only about 30 years old. Anne Bonny's fate is more mysterious. She pleads pregnancy, gets a reprieve, and then she just vanishes from the historical record. Some say her wealthy father paid to have her released, and she returned to a quiet life in the American colonies, living into her 80s. Others say she returned to piracy under a different name. Others say she died in prison, but it was not recorded. Nobody knows for sure. And honestly, that makes her story even better. She became a legend and then disappeared into mystery. But what I want you to notice about both Mary and Anne is this. They did not just break one rule. They broke every rule. They dressed as men. They became soldiers. They became pirates. They killed people. They stole. They defied every single expectation of how women were supposed to behave. And for a while they got away with it. They lived free in a way that almost no women of their era could imagine. Now let me take you to Portugal in the 1400s for a story so bizarre, so gothic, so absolutely insane, that if it was in a horror movie you would say it was too unrealistic. This is the story of Inês de Castro, and I am warning you now, it is dark. Inês is a Galician noblewoman serving as a lady-in-waiting to Constanza of Castile, who is married to Prince Pedro of Portugal. Pedro and Constanza have a proper royal marriage, politically arranged, producing children as expected. But Pedro falls in love with Inês, desperately, passionately in love. They start an affair that scandalizes the Portuguese court. When Constanza dies of natural causes, though rumours swirl, Pedro refuses to marry someone politically appropriate. Instead, he secretly marries Inês. This is a problem. Inês's family has too much influence. They are from Galicia, which has complicated political relationships with Portugal. King Afonso IV, Pedro's father, sees Inês and her family as a threat to Portuguese stability. So on January 7, 1355, King Afonso orders Inês's execution. She is stabbed to death in front of her young children. Pedro is away from court when this happens. When he returns and discovers what his father has done, he goes absolutely insane with grief and rage. He starts a civil war against his own father. When his father dies 2 years later and Pedro becomes king, Pedro takes his revenge. He hunts down the men who killed Inês. When he captures them, he has their hearts ripped out of their chests while they are still alive. Some accounts say he did it with his own hands. But here is where the story gets truly macabre. Pedro declares that he had legally married Inês, which means she was Queen of Portugal when she died, And if she was queen, she deserves to be treated as queen. So he has her corpse exhumed. After being dead for years, her body is dug up, dressed in royal robes, placed on a throne, and crowned Queen of Portugal. Then he forces the entire court, nobles, clergy, everyone, to pay homage to her corpse. They have to approach, bow, and kiss her hand. The hand of a corpse that has been dead for years. Can you even imagine being a noble, maybe someone who supported the execution, or maybe just someone who was neutral, and now you have to kiss the decaying hand of this dead woman while the king watches to make sure you show proper respect? It is psychological warfare. It is grief turned into grotesque spectacle. It is Pedro making absolutely certain that everyone understands the depth of his love for Inés and the price of harming her. Today, Pedro and Inés lie in twin tombs at the monastery of Alcobaça in Portugal. The tombs are positioned foot to foot, so that on Judgment Day when they rise from the dead, the first thing they see will be each other. It is one of the most romantic and simultaneously horrifying gestures in history. Now, not all women who broke the rules did so through violence or death. Some just decided to live life entirely on their own terms and society could deal with it. Meet Ninon de L'Enclos, who lived from 1620 to 1705, that is 85 years, which was extremely old for that era, and spent almost all of those years completely ignoring every rule about how women should behave. Ninon refused to marry. In an era when women had basically two options, marriage or convent, she chose neither. Instead, she became a courtesan, but not in the tragic way we usually think of courtesans. She was not dependent on one protector. She had multiple lovers over her lifetime, moved on when she wanted to, managed her own money, and remained independent. She ran a salon in Paris that became one of the most influential intellectual gathering places of the 17th century. Philosophers, writers, politicians, artists, everyone wanted an invitation to Ninon's salon. She discussed ideas with them as an equal. She shaped French culture through her influence, and she kept this up into her 80s. The young Voltaire supposedly met her when he was a boy and she was ancient, and she left him money in her will to buy books. She was essentially patronizing the next generation of Enlightenment thinkers from beyond the grave. Ninon's secret: she refused to let anyone control her. She made her own money, chose her own lovers, lived in her own house, thought her own thoughts. She took what she wanted from the courtesan role, financial support from wealthy men, but rejected the subservient parts. She was never anyone's property, and one more, because this one is just fun. Cora Pearl, born Emma Elizabeth Crouch in England in 1835. She transforms herself into one of the most famous courtesans in Paris during the Second Empire. But Cora is not subtle about anything. She is pure spectacle, pure performance. She shows up to a ball with her body dusted entirely in silver powder. She has herself served naked on a silver platter at a dinner party. Yes, actually lying on a platter like she is the main course. She wears outrageous outfits. She has affairs with Napoleon III's relatives. She lives in shocking luxury and makes sure everyone knows about it. Is she breaking rules? Absolutely. But she is doing it so publicly, so outrageously, that it almost becomes art. She is turning the role of courtesan into a kind of performance piece, making a mockery of the very society that both condemns and desires her. Now, what do all these women have in common? Pauline dueling in her corset, Mary and Anne becoming pirates, Inés being crowned after death, Ninon refusing marriage for 85 years, Cora serving herself on a platter. They all refused to be invisible. They all decided that whatever price society would make them pay, it was worth it to live authentically, boldly, on their own terms. Some paid with their lives, some became legends. Some were condemned, some were secretly admired, but none of them were forgotten, and that brings us to a crucial question. What did all these rule-breaking women, from Georgiana to Caroline to Marie Antoinette to the pirates and duelists and courtesans, what did they actually accomplish? What price did they really pay? And what can we learn from their choices centuries later? Because their stories are not just entertaining scandals, they are actually early, messy, often tragic attempts at something that would not become widespread for another century or more. Women claiming autonomy over their own lives. So let us look at the real consequences, the double standards, the lessons, and the legacy these women left behind. Here is something I've been thinking about as we have journeyed through these stories. We tend to romanticize historical scandals, do we not? We hear about forbidden love affairs and daring escapes and think, how exciting, how brave. But we need to talk about what actually happened to these women, the real, brutal consequences they faced for breaking society's rules. Because the price was not just social embarrassment or a damaged reputation. We are talking about execution, permanent exile from their children, complete erasure from their own lives. Let me break this down by category because the punishments varied, but they were all devastating in their own ways. First, execution, the ultimate price. We have already talked about Struensee's horrific death. Hands cut off, broken on the wheel, beheaded, body displayed for 4 years. That was the punishment for a man who dared to love a queen and try to reform a country. But what about the women? Marie Antoinette, of course, guillotined at 37 after months of imprisonment, separated from her children, subjected to a sham trial with accusations so vile they shocked even her enemies. Her last words were an apology for stepping on the executioner's foot. But there were others. Throughout history, women caught in adultery with royalty faced death. It was considered a form of treason because you were potentially introducing false heirs into the royal bloodline. Catherine Howard, the 5th wife of Henry VIII of England, was beheaded in 1542 at about 19 years old for adultery. Her head was cut off and displayed as a warning. Anne Boleyn, Henry's 2nd wife, was executed on charges of adultery that were almost certainly fabricated. She was 29. The message was clear. Women's bodies were not their own. They belonged to their husbands, to the state, to the continuation of bloodlines. Any sexual autonomy was literally a crime punishable by death. Compare this to the men. Henry VIII had 6 wives, executed 2 of them, divorced 2 others, and faced 0 consequences. Kings across Europe had mistresses openly fathered dozens of illegitimate children, and nobody suggested they should be beheaded for it. The double standard was not subtle, it was policy. Now, if you were lucky enough to avoid execution, you might face exile instead. Which sounds better, until you understand what exile actually meant for these women. Caroline Matilda was exiled to Calais at 21. She lived there for 3 years before dying of illness. 3 years of being completely cut off from her children, her country, her identity. She went from being Queen of Denmark to being nobody, imprisoned in a small castle with no real purpose, no real life. And remember, she was only allowed to live because her brother was the King of England and threatened war if Denmark executed her. If she had been less politically valuable, she would have been killed alongside Struensee. Georgiana's exile was different but equally painful. She was exiled to France while pregnant with Charles Grey's child, forced to give birth far from home, forced to surrender that baby immediately. Then she returned to England but was essentially exiled from her own happiness. She had to live with the man she did not love, watch her daughter from afar without ever being able to claim her, and pretend everything was fine. That is a different kind of exile. Not geographical, but emotional. Being exiled from your own child, your own love, your own authentic life. And here is what makes exile especially cruel for women in this era. It meant losing your children, always. Fathers had absolute legal custody. A divorced or exiled woman had zero rights to her children. Zero. She might never see them again. They would be raised to think their mother was wicked, shameful, someone to be ashamed of. Caroline Matilda's son, Crown Prince Frederick, grew up being told his mother was an adulteress who betrayed his father. He was taught to despise her memory. Georgiana's daughter Eliza grew up not knowing the Duchess of Devonshire was her mother. She thought she was the orphaned niece of the Grey family. When she occasionally saw Georgiana at social events, she had no idea she was looking at her own mother. Can you imagine that pain? Watching your child from across a room, unable to hug them, unable to tell them you love them, unable to even claim them as yours? This was the price of breaking the rules. Not just scandal, but the literal destruction of the mother-child bond. But even if you avoided execution and exile, there was a third punishment that was perhaps the most insidious: erasure. Society would simply erase you from history, remove you from the narrative, pretend you never existed, or rewrite your story to remove any agency or complexity. Think about how many women's stories we almost lost because historians did not think they mattered, or because the women's own families destroyed evidence to avoid shame. Mary Read and Anne Bonny should be as famous as Blackbeard or Captain Kidd, but they are footnotes in pirate history. Why? Because women were not supposed to be pirates, so their stories were minimized. The countless mistresses, courtesans, and influential women who shaped politics through their salons and their relationships. How many of them have we never heard of because their contributions were not considered proper history? Even the women we do know about have often been rewritten. Marie Antoinette became a monster in propaganda, and that version of her became the accepted truth for centuries. Only recently have historians started to look more carefully at what she actually did versus what she was accused of doing. Georgiana was remembered primarily for her gambling debts and scandals, not for her genuine political influence or her charity work. Caroline Matilda was labelled an adulteress, not recognised as someone who supported progressive reforms that could have improved Denmark. History erased their complexity, turned them into one-dimensional villains or victims, forgot that they were full human beings with contradictions, talents, flaws, dreams. And let us talk about the double standard because it is so blatant it hurts. When the Duke of Devonshire had 2 illegitimate children with Lady Elizabeth Foster and brought her to live in his house with his wife, society gossiped but accepted it. Men were expected to have mistresses. It was normal, even admired in some circles, a sign of virility. When Georgiana had one affair with Charles Grey and one illegitimate child, she was threatened with losing everything. Her husband used it as leverage to control her for the rest of her life. When King Christian VII of Denmark visited prostitutes constantly, had illegitimate children, and publicly humiliated his wife, nobody suggested he should be removed from the throne. When Caroline Matilda had an affair with Struensee, she was divorced, exiled, and nearly executed. When Louis XVI was ineffective, indecisive, and contributed to crisis through poor governance, he was eventually executed, but his failures were seen as political, not moral. When Marie Antoinette spent money, less money than her husband spent on hunting and locksmithing, by the way, she was labelled Madame Deficit and blamed for bankrupting France. The pattern is clear. Men could do almost anything and remain men. Women who did the same things became monsters. But here is what I find interesting. Despite these horrific consequences, despite knowing what could happen to them, women kept breaking the rules. Why? I think it is because the alternative, living a lie, being controlled, having no autonomy, felt worse than the potential punishment. At least if you broke the rules, you got to live authentically, even if only briefly. Georgiana had a few years of genuine happiness with Charles Grey. That affair gave her something real in a life full of performance and emptiness. Was it worth the price she paid? She might say yes. Caroline Matilda had maybe 2 years of real partnership with Struensee, where she was respected as an intellectual equal, where she was helping to reform a country, where she was loved for who she was. 2 years out of 23, but maybe those 2 years were worth everything. Marie Antoinette, if she really did love Axel von Fersen, had someone who saw her as a person, not a symbol. In a life where everyone wanted something from her, heirs, political alliances, a scapegoat, she had one person who just wanted her. Even if it ended in tragedy, even if it contributed to her death, maybe it was worth it to feel truly loved. And the women who became pirates, who duelled in corsets, who refused to marry, who lived as men, they got to taste freedom that most women of their era could not even imagine. Mary Red got to fight in battles. Anne Bonny got to command a pirate ship. Ninon de L'Enclos got to run her own salon, control her own money, sleep with whoever she wanted, and live to 85 on her own terms. Yes, some of them died young, yes, some faced terrible consequences, but they lived, really lived, not just existed as decorative objects in someone else's story, and that matters. Now, I want to be clear, I am not saying their choices were always right or smart or admirable. Georgiana hurt people with her gambling debts. Marie Antoinette was genuinely out of touch with the suffering of French people. The pirates killed people. These were complicated women making complicated choices in impossible situations. But what I am saying is that their willingness to break rules, to risk everything for autonomy, for love, for freedom, that paved the way for every woman who came after them. Every time a woman in the 1800s got a little more freedom, a little more legal rights, a little more respect, it was partly because women before her had broken the rules so thoroughly that society had to adapt. The first women who demanded the right to own property, to have custody of their children, to divorce abusive husbands, to vote, to work, to be educated, they were building on the groundwork laid by women who had broken those rules informally, illegally. Georgiana's political campaigning was scandalous in 1784. By the mid-1800s, women were organizing political movements. By the early 1900s, they were voting. Caroline Matilda and Struensee's progressive reforms were undone after their deaths, but the ideas did not die. Denmark eventually adopted many of those same reforms, just decades later. Marie Antoinette's tragedy showed the world what happens when propaganda and mob justice replace actual justice. Her execution was one of the moments that made people start questioning whether the French Revolution had gone too far. These women were not trying to be revolutionaries, they were just trying to live. But by living authentically in a world that demanded they conform, they became revolutionaries anyway. So what is their legacy? It is complicated, messy, imperfect, just like they were, but it is real, and it mattered. And now, as we come to the end of our journey through these scandalous lives, I want to look at what these stories mean for us today. Because we still live in a world with double standards, with rules that control women's bodies and choices, with punishment for those who step out of line. The specifics have changed, but the patterns remain. So what can we learn from Georgiana, Caroline, Marie Antoinette, and all the other rule breakers? What do their stories tell us about courage, about sacrifice, about the cost of authenticity? Let us bring all these threads together and find the meaning in the scandal. We have spent hours together now, travelling through ballrooms and palace corridors, witnessing love affairs and political scandals, watching women risk everything for a chance at something real. And now, as dawn approaches and our journey comes to an end, I want to ask you one final question. What would you have done? If you were Georgiana, would you have chosen your existing children over the man you loved and the baby you were carrying? If you were Caroline Matilda, would you have risked everything for love with Struensee and the chance to reform Denmark? If you were Marie Antoinette, would you have stayed loyal to Fersen even knowing it could cost you your life? These are impossible questions, and that's exactly the point. Because what these women faced were not simple moral dilemmas where there was a clear right answer. They were impossible choices in systems designed to give them no good options. And yet they chose, they acted, they lived. Let me tell you what I think these women taught us, what their scandals and tragedies and brief moments of happiness can teach us even now, 200 years later. First, they taught us that love is powerful enough to make people risk everything, even when it is foolish to do so. Every single woman we talked about, Georgiana, Caroline Matilda, Marie Antoinette, they all knew the risks. They were not naive. They understood that adultery could cost them their children, their positions, their lives. They did it anyway. Why? Because when you are trapped in a loveless marriage, when you are treated as property rather than a person, when you have spent years feeling invisible or controlled or unwanted, and then someone sees you, really sees you, it changes everything. Fersen saw Marie Antoinette as Marie, not as the Austrian woman or the queen or the scapegoat. He loved the person behind the crown. Struensee saw Caroline Matilda as an intelligent partner, capable of understanding philosophy and supporting political reform, not just a womb to produce heirs. Charles Grey saw Georgiana as passionate and political and worth-loving, not just as the duchess or the gambling addict or the disappointing wife. And for these women, being seen like that, being loved for who they actually were, was worth the risk. Now you might say that is irrational, that love is not worth dying for or losing your children for or destroying your life for. And maybe you are right. Maybe it is irrational. But humans are not rational creatures. We are emotional, passionate, desperate for connection, and sometimes love makes us brave in ways that reason never could. Second, these women taught us that political change is dangerous, especially when you try to do too much too fast. Think about Struensee. He tried to transform Denmark overnight. 2,200 laws in less than 2 years, abolishing torture, establishing freedom of the press, dismantling aristocratic privilege, modernizing the entire country. And he was right. His reforms were progressive, enlightened, genuinely good for common people. But he moved so fast that he created too many enemies at once. The old nobility, the church, the conservatives, they all united against him because he threatened their power, and they destroyed him. The lesson is not that reform is bad. The lesson is that reform requires building coalitions, moving strategically, understanding that entrenched power will fight back viciously when threatened. Caroline Matilda paid the price for Struensee's idealism. She supported his reforms, she believed in them, but she was punished when those reforms created enemies powerful enough to stage a coup. Georgiana learned this lesson too. After the 1784 election scandal, she mostly withdrew from public political work. She continued to influence politics behind the scenes, but she understood that being too visible as a woman in politics made her vulnerable to attacks. Third, these women taught us that society punishes women far more harshly than men for the exact same behaviour. This one is so obvious throughout all these stories that it barely needs explaining, but I am going to say it anyway because it is important. The Duke of Devonshire openly lived with his mistress, had children with her, brought her into his home. Society gossiped, but ultimately accepted it. Georgiana had one affair, one illegitimate child, and her husband used it to control her for the rest of her life, threatening to take away her other children if she did not comply with his wishes. King Christian VII was mentally unstable, abusive, unfaithful. Nobody suggested removing him from the throne until the very end. Caroline Matilda had an affair with his doctor. She was divorced, exiled, and nearly executed. Louis XVI contributed massively to France's problems through incompetent leadership. He was eventually executed, but for political reasons, not moral ones. Marie Antoinette spent less money than he did, but was labelled Madame Deficit and blamed for bankrupting France. Her execution was as much about destroying a symbol as punishing actual crimes. The double standard was policy, it was law, it was culture. And here is what is frustrating. We like to think we have moved past this, that modern society treats men and women equally when they break rules. But do we, really? When a male politician has an affair, we call it a scandal and move on. When a female politician has an affair, we question her judgment, her morality, her fitness for office. When a man is ambitious and ruthless in business, we call him a strong leader. When a woman is ambitious and ruthless, we call her cold, calculating, unlikable. When a father prioritizes his career over spending time with his children, we say he is providing for his family. When a mother does the same thing, we say she is neglecting her children. The specifics have changed. We do not execute women for adultery anymore, thank goodness. But the pattern, the double standard, the harsher judgment, the different expectations, it is still there. Fourth, these women taught us that sometimes the only way to live authentically is to accept that you will be punished for it. Mary Read and Anne Bonny could have lived as poor women, confined to women's work, women's expectations, women's limitations. Instead, they dressed as men, became soldiers, became pirates, fought and killed and lived free. They knew they would be punished if caught. They did it anyway because the alternative, living a conventional woman's life, felt like a slower death. Ninon de L'Enclos could have married, settled down, lived respectably. Instead, she refused marriage, had multiple lovers, ran an intellectual salon, and lived to 85 on her own terms. Society condemned her as immoral. She did not care. Pauline von Metternich could have meekly accepted defeat in an argument about flowers. Instead, she fought a duel in her corset because her honour mattered more than propriety. These women decided that being themselves, even if it meant scandal, was better than being acceptable but miserable. And I think that is brave. Foolish sometimes, yes. Self-destructive sometimes, absolutely. But also deeply, fundamentally brave. Fifth, and this might be the most important lesson, these women taught us that individual acts of rebellion, even when they fail, pave the way for systemic change. None of these women were trying to start a feminist revolution. They were just trying to live their lives, love who they wanted, have some autonomy. But every time a woman broke a rule and forced society to deal with it, the rule got a little weaker. When Georgiana campaigned publicly for the Whigs in 1784, she was scandalous. But she also proved that women could be politically influential. She made it slightly easier for the women who came after her to enter politics. When Caroline Matilda supported Struensee's progressive reforms, she was part of a movement that eventually succeeded, just decades later than they hoped. Denmark did adopt freedom of the press, did abolish torture, did modernize, just not in their lifetime. When Marie Antoinette became a symbol of everything wrong with absolute monarchy, her execution was one of the factors that eventually led to constitutional monarchy and better checks on royal power across Europe. These women were not revolutionaries by intention. but they became revolutionaries by necessity, and their failures taught the next generation what not to do, how to be strategic, how to push for change without getting destroyed in the process. By the mid-1800s, women were organizing formal political movements. By the late 1800s, they were fighting for suffrage, for property rights, for custody of their children. By the early 1900s, they were voting. None of that happens without women like Georgiana, Caroline, and Marie Antoinette first breaking the rules informally, showing that women could be political, could make their own choices, could matter beyond being wives and mothers. Now, I want to address something important. These women were all aristocrats. They were privileged. Even in their suffering, they had resources that common women could never dream of. Georgiana lost millions gambling, but she lived in palaces. Caroline Matilda was exiled, but to a castle with servants. Marie Antoinette was executed, but she lived as a queen for years first. Common women faced even worse. They had fewer options, harsher punishments, less ability to fight back. The servant girls, the factory workers, the women who were raped by their employers with no recourse, the women who died in childbirth because they could not afford doctors. We do not know their names, we do not have their letters, we do not tell their stories. So when we talk about these aristocratic women as brave rule breakers, we need to remember that they represent only a tiny fraction of women's experiences. They are the stories that survive because they involved famous people. But every woman who quietly defied an abusive husband, who found ways to support herself, who protected her children, who survived impossible circumstances, they were brave too. More brave, maybe, because they had less to fall back on. Sixth, these women taught us that history remembers scandal more than substance. Georgiana is famous for her gambling debts and her love triangle with the Duke and Bess. But she was also a genuine political force, a published author, a patron of the arts, scientific enthusiast who collected minerals. Caroline Matilda is remembered as an adulteress, but she was also a supporter of the Enlightenment reforms that could have made Denmark a better place. Marie Antoinette is remembered for "let them eat cake," which she never said, and for bankrupting France, which she did not do. We forget that she did extensive charity work, that she was a devoted mother, that she faced her execution with remarkable dignity. Society reduces complex women to their scandals because scandal is entertaining, because it is easier to judge someone as purely good or purely bad than to acknowledge their complexity. But these women were not symbols, they were people. Flawed, complicated, contradictory people who made both good and bad choices. So here is my question for you. 200 years from now, what will people remember about the women of our time? Will they remember the substance, the scientists, the activists, the artists, the mothers, the workers, the women who changed the world through their efforts? Or will they remember the scandals, the affairs, controversies, the moments when women stepped out of line and were punished for it? I hope it is the substance. But based on history, I suspect it will be both. Finally, these women taught us that love, in all its forms, is what makes us human. Not just romantic love, though that is part of it, but love for your children, love for your ideals, love for freedom, love for yourself. Georgiana loved her children more than she loved Charles Grey. That is why she gave up her lover and her illegitimate daughter to keep the children she already had. It broke her heart, but it was love that made the choice. Caroline Matilda loved the idea of a better Denmark, a more enlightened society. That is why she supported Struensee's reforms even when they made her enemies. Marie Antoinette loved being seen as a real person, not just a symbol. That is why Fersen mattered so much to her, why she risked everything to keep that connection. Love made them human, love made them vulnerable, Love made them brave. Love destroyed them. Love saved them. Love is what we remember, and that brings me to the end of our journey together. We have spent these hours in the company of remarkable women, scandalous women, brave women, foolish women, tragic women, women who broke every rule society gave them and paid prices we can barely imagine. They were not perfect, they were not always admirable, but they were undeniably, absolutely, courageously themselves. Georgiana gambling away fortunes while secretly supporting political reform and mourning the child she could never claim. Caroline Matilda riding astride in men's clothing while trying to modernize a kingdom before being torn from her children and exiled to die alone at 23. Marie Antoinette finding love in impossible circumstances while the world fell apart around her, walking to the guillotine with dignity after being stripped of everything else, and all the others, the duelists and pirates and courtesans and queens who said no to the lives they were supposed to live and yes to something more authentic, even knowing the cost. Their stories matter, not because they are cautionary tales, though they are that too, but because they show us the full range of what it means to be human, to love and lose, to risk and fail, to live authentically even when the world punishes you for it. And maybe, just maybe, their stories can inspire us to be a little braver in our own lives, to take the risks that matter, to love even when it is complicated, to break the rules that need breaking, to live authentically even when it is easier to conform, because that is their legacy. Not the scandals themselves, but the courage behind them, the refusal to be invisible, the insistence on being seen as fully human with all the complexity that entails. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about Georgiana writing desperate letters to her mother about gambling debts while also campaigning for political reform. Think about Caroline Matilda riding through Copenhagen in scarlet breeches, free for just a moment before it all came crashing down. Think about Marie Antoinette and Fersen writing love letters in code, stealing moments of happiness in the shadow of the guillotine. Think about all the women, famous and forgotten, who broke rules and paid prices and paved the way for the freedoms we have now. And maybe tomorrow you will be a little braver too. Thank you for spending these hours with me. Thank you for listening to these stories, for caring about these women, for thinking deeply about what their lives mean. I hope you found something valuable in this journey through scandal and tragedy and brief shining moments of joy. I hope you sleep well, with dreams full of palaces and pirates, love letters and revolutions, women who dared to be themselves no matter what the world demanded. And when you wake up, I will be here with more stories, because history is full of them, thousands of untold stories about remarkable people doing extraordinary things, and I cannot wait to share them with you. Until then, sleep well, dream of the rule breakers, and remember that you too have the right to live authentically, to love boldly, to break the rules that need breaking. Good night, and thank you for being here.